On Friday last, I did a live Zoom with Dr. Dale Tuggy, and this is just a very brief introduction to it. It was a great interview. It was really, really long. I decided not to chop it up because it would just take forever to go through it all and segment it all up. So I was putting it out there unedited. We discuss the Trinity. We discuss the early church. We discuss Islam and the Prophet Muhammad, his beliefs about God, and why Dell isn't a Muslim, given that his beliefs about God are the same as the Prophet Muhammad's. So, who is Dale Tuggy? Well, if you don't know, he served as Professor of Philosophy at the University of New York for some 18 years. He's taught courses in analytical theology, philosophy of religion, religious studies, and the history of philosophy. He's authored about 24 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters relating to the Trinity, and he is a Unitarian. So he is a Christian but doesn't believe in the Trinity. So he doesn't believe Jesus is God or the Holy Spirit is God. He just believes the Father is one person, is one God. He's the producer and host of the Trinities podcast, which explores theories about the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And he's author of the book, which has been quite critically acclaimed, called What is the Trinity? Thinking about the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And he's published a huge amount of literature on early biblical Unitarian movements in the United States and so on. So go to his website, which is Trinities, that's Trinities, Trinities plural, .org. And here is our long discussion. Fast forward through bits of it if you want. There are some nuggets in there, I must say. I did enjoy myself, and it was a great honour to have him on blogging Theology. So this is the introduction. Now is the movie itself, the movie Dale Tuggy on blogging Theology. Certainly long enough to be a movie. Till next time. Okay, I'm recording. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and hello and welcome to Dr. Dale Tuggy, all the way from Tennessee in the United States of America. So, thank you for joining us on blogging Theology.
Thanks
And,
for having me, Paul.
and how are you today, particularly with all this COVID madness going on? I hope you're well.
Very good, healthy, enjoying some English type weather, cold, dark, and depressing, but we're keeping a stiff upper lip over here.
Actually, the weather forecast for Tuesday of this week is 23 degrees, which for us is just balmy, hot weather. So crazy, crazy. So, well, thank you very much indeed. So we have discussed prior to this what we might talk about, and there's a couple of things I wanted just to invite you to comment on. What one are just a couple of passages in the New Testament, which are usually taken to refer to a Trinitarian understanding of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and then move on perhaps to the early church and how they articulated their concept of God, with particularly people like Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, and others before the great Trinitarian theologians of the 4th and 5th century, like Augustine, who I think are indisputably Trinitarian. So if I could just ask you, Dale, first of all, just to comment on one great passage in the Gospel of John, which is always understood to by Trinitarian Christians to understand. It is understood to refer to Jesus as being God in a very straightforward way, where this is Jesus and Thomas in John chapter 20, verse 28. Then Jesus says to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." So that seemed to, the belief there that's been referred to, at least in part, is Jesus being Lord and God, it seems, for John. How would you interpret that in your own perspective, do you think?
Well, context is king. And whenever you see a passage where people are alleging that it's identifying together Jesus and God as one and the same, you should just look elsewhere in the same chapter and you'll see somewhere the author is clearly presupposing that they're different from one another, that they're numerically different and that they're qualitatively different. Right. So here, if you look at the people sometimes say, "Hey, look, John tells you at the beginning and the end that Jesus is God," in 1:1, and then here at the end he tells you that he's God again. So obviously he's God. This is a terrible reading of the whole book. You have to read and absorb the entire book and get a really good overall idea of what he thinks about Jesus and God.
Mm.
Um, what his real end of the book, or maybe the original ending of the book, is at the end of this chapter, where he says that these things are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. So
Mm.
that's his punchline. That's the big point he wants you to get. Not that Jesus is God, but that he's the Messiah, the Son of God. Also, right above this, he has Jesus say to Mary Magdalene after he's been risen that he's about to ascend to his Father, to my God and your God. And so the Father is his God. If you look at the whole book and you get away from the like 5 favorite proof texts that Trinitarian interpreters glom onto, you see that the book, it is exalting Jesus by describing him in shockingly elevated terms. I am the way, the truth, the life. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But also, it's really sharply distinguishing between Jesus and God the entire time. God is somebody else in this book. Jesus is God. He's the one true God. Jesus gets his power and his message and his commission from God. Jesus calls upon God to be, an independent witness to him. So he's not just speaking on behalf of himself. Um, and so you get a consistent picture. Okay, so what is happening here? There's 2 different ways that one could take. I mean, look, you just can't take it that he's identifying Jesus with God when he's been distinguishing Jesus from God from the whole book, right? Um, God is not going to say, I only do what I see somebody else doing,
Mm.
or I need someone else to witness for me, or I got my message and my power from somebody else. God is not going to say things like that. So some interpreters, because of their love of mysteries, this part of mainstream tradition that they've absorbed, they're happy to just interpret John as contradicting himself. That John identifies Jesus with God and also distinguishes Jesus from God. And then you're just supposed to enjoy the mystery somehow. Well, that's nonsense. That's an uncharitable reading of John.
Mm.
And if we can take him to be coherent, we should try to take him to be coherent in his own terms. Now, he's already handed us 2 different ways to take this. One way you could take it is if you really think Thomas is calling Jesus both Lord and God, well, he would have to be using the word God in a lesser sense. In John 10, Jesus himself makes this point that that it was part of Jewish tradition at the time that beings other than God could be referred to as gods. Now, he also clarifies that he's not claiming to be God, but he's only claiming to be God's son. But he's got this argument that if these lesser guys could be called by this higher title, God,
Yeah.
if that's not blasphemous, then I, the Messiah, who am greater than those guys, it can't be blasphemous to call me by this lesser title,
Mm.
Son of God. So that's his argument in John 10. Um, so, he could be calling the risen Jesus his God in a subordinate sense, where the one who's called God actually is someone under the one true God.
Mm.
Um, and that's how some Unitarian Christians will interpret this. But I think a better interpretation is to understand this in a first century context where Thomas here is being portrayed as the first person to give the early Christian double confession that you see in Paul in 1 Corinthians 8 and in Ephesians 4, where there's a common confession of one God, and also one Lord. And I think Thomas is being portrayed. Now, it says he says this to Jesus. Yes, he's literally saying this to Jesus. A big theme earlier in the book, and somebody who's written many pages about this is my friend Kermit Zarley,
No.
in his book, The Restitution of Jesus Christ. And he cites other scholarship to this effect as well.
Mm.
Earlier in the book, a big theme has been that, hey, it's really God working through Jesus.
Mm.
I am in the Father's in me.
Mm.
If you've seen me, you've seen the Father, not because he is the Father, but because he's like the Father. And basically, they're about the same business.
Mm.
That's what he means when he says the Father and I are one, that they're about the same business.
Yeah.
And so Thomas, who's been doubting, he's seen that Jesus has died a disgraceful, humiliating death, and he's not believing people that have said they have seen him risen.
Mm.
When he uh, says to him, "My Lord and my God," I think he's acknowledging that Jesus is his Lord and that his God is working through Jesus. He's acknowledging God and Jesus, in other words.
Mm.
I think that's probably a better, more contextual reading.
I think overall you're right. I mean, I would just say two further things. We're perhaps not going to agree on this. I think John represents a highly interpreted, highly developed Christology, which is not historical to the extent that it is developed and highly interpreted, and that's a commonplace in New Testament scholarship. So I would be very reluctant to see any of these purple passages, well, the I am passages, as historical in the sense of actually coming from Jesus of Nazareth himself. Um, but also it does strike me that this gospel is a hostage to fortune in retrospect, because it does have these statements in it which a simpler person, not a professor of philosophy or former professor of philosophy, such as yourself, a simpler soul would take more literally. And this might be a criticism of the gospel itself, in its imaginative and creative presentation, that it has given to posterity. We know this retrospectively, a set of texts that have been used to assert not just a metaphorical or a lesser sense of Jesus' divinity, but an absolute metaphysical literalness. And this could be a criticism one could make of the gospel itself for not giving a clearer picture. One has to be a very sophisticated either philosopher or hermeneuticist or scholar to really nuance this issue.
Yeah.
And of course, we all know in the real world that doesn't always pan out to the general population, who have nevertheless embraced these texts. Like Billy Graham, I'm not saying he was an idiot, but he used these texts in a much more simplistic way to make a
Well,
very different
yeah.
point.
Yeah. No, John. I mean, the historicity question is tortured. I mean, if you accept a traditional authorship, then you might well think that the Apostle John feels plenty bold to just tell the story in a very different way based on his memories. Um, but yeah, John, he's very abstract, and I think he's probably trying to counter some sort of early Gnostic type of views and sort of one up them, whereas they have a Christ who isn't really a man, but only appears to be one, and he's some kind of lesser
Yeah.
divine being, some kind of eon. He's like I'm going to one up you. The very wisdom or word by which God created the heavens and the earth, this is in Jesus.
Mm,
So you want heavenly origin? I'll give you heavenly origin. It goes back to the beginning.
mm,
But you're right. I think the book does lend itself to being misunderstood,
mm.
but I don't think we can blame the author for not seeing the Logos theorists coming along 40, 50 years later, depending when you think this was written.
Of course.
It's essentially been hijacked by the Logos theorists,
Yeah.
and they put all priority on the opening,
Yeah.
and they want to read everything in light of that.
Well, logos is there in John 1:1. In the beginning was the word.
Mm-hmm.
So just to ask you about this question about Jesus going around in John saying, "I am this, I am that." These statements are only found in one gospel, the Gospel of John. If you take these statements as historical, I mean, I don't, but if you do, I assume you do, why does no one else ever mention Jesus making these statements? If Jesus had gone around making these statements, they would be the most incredible statements. Why did Luke, for example, who claims to have,
Yeah.
all these things carefully from the beginning, dear Theophilus, fail to mention them? Ditto Mark, ditto Matthew. Why did no one else? Why did Paul never mention Jesus saying these things? And these seem to be put a question mark against their historicity if they were so uttered so publicly and were so shocking. I am the light of the world is not a statement that you just ignore. And
Mm-hmm.
the Son of Man sayings predominate in the Synoptic Gospels. In John, the Son of Man, there's only like one reference, I think, to the Son of Man. You
Yeah.
know, the big slogans are the I am slogans.
Yeah.
So would you defend the historicity of them in the light of this absence in all the other earlier historical sources?
I don't know. This is a good objection. I'm not sure if it's a decisive objection. We know that Mark got the ball rolling, and people loved the gospel according to Mark, but they also felt the need to redo it, partly because of its unsatisfying ending, and
Beginning.
partly because I think they knew about other traditions that weren't included there. And so Matthew and Luke stick pretty close to Mark.
Mm.
Um, it's not out of the range of possibility for me that there was just a lot of stuff in the way that John would tell it that's not in the way that, say, Peter would tell it if Mark was an associate of Peter. And so you could have this additional stuff. It depends on. I'm assuming a late date for John as well.
Mm.
Um, I do assume that. I'm not. I'm anything far from certain about that. Um, but I do think it implicitly sort of claims to be by an eyewitness, and
Yeah,
so I'm
it,
uh,
it,
I'm
it,
not
it
I'm
does.
not as skeptical of the traditional authorship as a lot of scholars are now.
No, I think Richard Balcombe in his book Jesus and the Eyewitness does advance a strong case for apostolic authorship, but he also says, and this often gets overlooked by people, if John is the author, I mean, the historical disciple of Jesus, John, was
Hmm.
the author of the Gospel of John. He also says, Balcombe, that it's still a highly interpreted account. Doesn't mean, therefore, we
Hmm.
have, like a New York Times reporter just verbatim recording
Hmm.
his words.
Hmm.
Balcombe still allows, indeed advances the view that it's highly interpreted by John. So the authorship question doesn't really alter the equation, really. People think it
Hmm.
does. Oh, well, he actually saw Jesus, therefore these are verbatim accounts. Even defenders of apostolic authorship like Balcombe do not say that. They say
Hmm.
he meditated long and hard. He reflected on the significance of Jesus for his life and presented this highly interpreted account. So you're back to the same position as all the other non-apostolic authorship defenders in terms of this highly developed Christology. You haven't changed that equation at all. And that for me is the crucial point. Not
Hmm.
the authorship doesn't change that, as far as that's my reading of Balcombe anyway.
Hmm.
But I want to press you. So you say you're not convinced. So it could be argued either way about the historicity question. Just take Luke, for example, beginning of Luke's gospel and the prologue. It seemed like a good idea to, I'm paraphrasing, good idea to me, dear Theophilus, to write an orderly account of the events that have taken place amongst us, etc.
Hmm.
And Luke is seen as a kind of ancient historian, and rightly so. He's setting out, according to the standards of ancient historiography, a portrait, an account of his hero's life. He does that in Acts, he does that in Luke.
Hmm.
If Jesus had gone around publicly saying, before Abraham was, I am the light of the world, I am the resurrection of the life, these amazing. Why is there zero trace of this at all in Luke's
Hmm.
account? Was he just a really bad historian? Or the alternative case, the only other option I can see is that Jesus didn't say this stuff. And indeed, this is a product of John's own reflective Christology at a later date. How would you decide that?
Yeah, I mean, genre is very important. And just, the fact that we put quotation marks into our translations might be a little bit misleading. I think the original audience would not have presupposed that somebody took all this down in shorthand, and that therefore all this is verbatim what he said. I think all New Testament scholars think that the authors of all the Gospels are basically kind of sketching portraits, and it's not so much. It's not that they were being sloppy, or they didn't care about the truth of the matter, but they're trying to, create scenes that tell you what kind of what his significance was,
Mm,
what he would have said. um, with John, yeah, it's not clear how much sort of later thinking has entered into it. You have to remember that early Christianity was extremely charismatic. They believe that God had poured out the Spirit, then their sons and daughters will prophesy,
mm.
and that has any of this worked its way into the account? Things that they believe that the risen Jesus has told them. Um, I don't know.
Mm.
Um,
Okay.
if anyway, I'm not sure how it matters too much to the theology and Christology. For
I
the
think
simple reason that, as I understand this book, it really is consistent with the synoptics. And
it matters to me. I mean, on the theological
the
level, yeah.
style is different. He starts off with this grandiose, like, I'm going to tell you the cosmological significance of all this,
Mm, mm, mm.
rather than his origin story in terms of, where he was born and so on. And that's, there's probably a good reason for that. There's probably also a good reason for why he explicitly has Jesus say that he's a man. John 8:40, I'm a man who told you the truth that I heard from God.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And has the disciples touching him.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree
It's
that there's
probably anti-Docetist
I,
material.
I agree with you. It is anti-Docetist. He's probably reacting against Gnostic influences, and that will put him towards the end of the first century, of course, not at an early date, because Gnosticism is not something that we're aware of existing
Mm-hmm.
really in
Yeah.
the earlier times. So that will push the date away from apostolic authorship into a second generation authorship, although it could be drawing on earlier material. Okay.
Yeah, and the division between the Jews and the Christians, I think, is more than
Exactly.
you would see like in the time of Paul by far. So I think
I
that's
was,
what
that's
makes you have to take it to be late, really.
exactly. I was just thinking exactly that point actually. Okay, well perhaps can we just briefly just touch on, if I may, Matthew 28, the famous baptism formula. Sorry, I'll just get it out here, which of course we all know very well. The commissioning of the disciples, it says here in my NRSV translation, the 11 disciples went to Galilee. Jesus then commissions them and says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you." Now, this is a good segue into the next subject, really, of the patristic and early church liturgical use of this formula. I think this triadic formula, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit,
Mm-hmm.
as a kind of embryonic Trinitarian creed. Actually, these are kind of creedettes or little creeds in the New Testament. Um, but how just coming the issue of exegesis of that passage, when the singular name is used, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son, are we to assume therefore a singular entity here that has those three names associated with it, or how would you pass that?
I think it's to be taken as in the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, and in the name of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
But the name is really just kind of the reality of the thing.
Mm.
Um, the overall approach to this, you have to look at the big picture. Look at everything Matthew says about Jesus and about God. You have the one God being the Father, just like in the rest of the New Testament. You have the big hammered over and over point about Jesus, that he's God's Christ, God's Messiah. He's a real man. He has a human mother. So there's no way that he's going to like drop this Trinitarian bomb at the end of his book. Oh, by the way, there's three who are God. It's ridiculous. It's not, again, it's not a charitable reading of Matthew.
Right.
Now there is a textual issue here. There are quotations in Eusebius where it just has baptizing in my name or in the name of Jesus or something like that.
Yeah.
I think I'm more inclined to be conservative and go with what the actual Greek texts say. So I accept this reading, but it's important to see, the reading that's in our critical editions of the New Testament. But it's important to see that somebody could dig up a pot in Egypt tomorrow and find a copy of the Gospel according to Matthew from the year 170 or something, and it would flip this over in one day, right? Just one little piece of evidence could flip it right around. So is it possible somebody made this more triadic? Maybe. So, I mean, about it being a Trinitarian formula or,
In embryo.
like a strict liturgical formula.
Yeah.
Look, you don't see that in Acts where they just seem to baptize in the name of
True.
Jesus.
True.
So it seems like it wouldn't be taken that way. And, I think it can just be taken in a way like this. In American Westerns, when the police force in the small Western town is inadequate, sometimes they need to go get the bad guys that just robbed the bank. They're going to deputize people. Right. And so say the sheriff, I hereby deputize you in the name of the president, the Constitution, and the law or something. He's throwing together things of three very different categories, that he's invoking, as kind of the basis for his doing this.
Is this an original Tennessee reading of Matthew 28?
It's probably a Texan reading.
Oh,
I'm originally
Texan.
from Texas, so that
reading.
accent was probably more Texas than Tennessee. But
I'm impressed with this application. I mean,
so,
staying on that point, if I may, I, I'm
mhm,
I'm going to quote some scholarly text now because I not at random because I think they're actually quite valuable. This book, which I know you know, Early
yeah,
Christian Creeds by J.N.D. Kelly, who was an English
yeah. I
biblical
wish
scholar.
somebody would write a better one, but it's a very valuable book.
I like it. I used it when I
Hmm.
was, I was introduced when I was doing as an undergraduate to his work, and the other one
Hmm.
is Early Christian Doctrines, which are my favorite books of all time. But he says this on this very issue, and I'll just read you what he says. This is apropos the triadic quasi-creedal scraps, he calls them, and he talks about the Didache. Sometimes these embryonic confessions, this one he mentions before, exhibit an explicitly Trinitarian character. The Didache, for example, I'll just mention for the people who don't know, the Didache is a text which was only rediscovered, I think it was the 19th century. Didache means teaching. It's a Greek word meaning teaching, allegedly by the apostles, although no one actually thinks that. But it is dated seriously early by some scholars, even in the first century, as a kind of Jewish Christian text. And it's a fascinating read. It has been, I personally think it's possibly a composite text. I think it's been heavily interpolated, and this is a crucial point when it comes to taking some of these statements. Actually, maybe they're not from the first century, maybe they're been added later by early church people, we don't know. But anyway, the Didache we have now, despite all of that, he says the Didache, for example, gives unmistakable directions for for the administration of baptism. Quote, after you have said all these things, baptize in running water in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And then he talks about the Eucharist. If this is a first century text, I mean, it's probably quoting from Matthew or the tradition that Matthew is drawing on, maybe the M tradition. But for J.N.D. Kelly, and without going into all of his arguments, he sees that as a Trinitarian, explicitly Trinitarian text. And my point really is that,
Well,
like John, if I could just say, like John,
mhm.
in Thomas's acclamation of Jesus as Lord and God. Now, John can't be held personally responsible for later usage of his text, of course, but it seems to be a parallel or something similar happening with Matthew 28 as well. However right you may be in your exegesis, and I personally find it quite plausible, nevertheless, in the early Christian communities, the Didache being one example, it was pretty early on interpreted in a Trinitarian way. And that's the point I want to make. Whatever the rightness and wrongness of your exegesis is almost beside the point in terms of the developing liturgy and theology of the church, which did interpret these texts in a Trinitarian way. And so,
Well, when you say Trinitarian, I think you mean subordinationist with two lesser divinities. But let me comment on Kelly's statement that this is, clearly Trinitarian. That's clearly wrong. It's a clear, blatant anachronism, because in the New Testament, the Holy Spirit and the Son are not supposed to be two eternal, fully divine persons in addition to the Father. In fact, there is no term in the New Testament or phrase that refers to God understood as triune, and
no,
this isn't an exception to that. Now you have a mention of the three, but remember who they are. The Father, that's a synonym for God. The Son is the man, and the Holy Spirit is God's spirit, I think understood in a Jewish way. Now, yes, you can find people in the second century that think the one true God is the Father, and then there are these lesser divine beings. That's true. We'll come back to that. But the question is, why are the three being thrown together? And it's not because there's a presupposition that there's a triune God. What I describe this as, and I have described this in some of my presentations and a few of my publications, I think, is it's a Christian unity slogan. So in the first century, there was no one bishop system to give a unity to the whole thing. There was no, church hierarchy and structure. And so there was a constant tendency for things to fly apart. Well, I follow Peter, I follow Paul, I follow John, I follow Thomas.
Mm.
There's a constant tendency for things to spread apart from one another, and to spread out to fill the vacuum, basically. And so you see these slogans in the New Testament. Ephesians 4 is an interesting one. One God, one baptism, one Spirit, one Lord,
Mm.
one faith. And so here, they're being initiated, they're being brought into this community, which is unified by having one God, that's the Father, one Lord, that's the Son, and
Mm.
one Spirit, like one Spirit that's given to them to empower them, that's the Holy Spirit. So just they're being mentioned together like this, it's consistent with, the author thinking that they're of the same ontological status, but it's also totally consistent with what I just said,
Mm.
that he's mentioning these things that all Christians everywhere, no matter which apostle they're following, have in common. And it's the riches enjoyed by all, basically. One God, one Lord, one Spirit.
Can I just challenge you on one thing there? Not
Mm-hmm.
your metaphysics, I fundamentally accept. So I'm not disagreeing with you from a Trinitarian view, but in terms of a response from history,
Mm-hmm.
Ignatius of Antioch, as you know, we now know wrote 7 authentic letters, and he's traditionally
Well,
understood.
maybe I'm a little more skeptical than the mainstream on him.
Um, he apparently died or was martyred in AD 106.
Mm-hmm.
That's the traditional date. And there are statements in his letters which are where indisputably he calls Jesus God, but not in the sense that Thomas may have called Jesus God. I would argue, but in the metaphysical sense, in the later sense of Jesus being a fully divine being.
Mm-hmm.
So when because of the uncertainty about the dating of the Didache, um, and it being a composite work and quite
Yeah,
possibly,
a lot would put the Didache in the early second century.
indeed, that's
Yeah.
a perfectly plausible
Mm-hmm.
suggestion. Um, but that would reinforce the point I'm making, that you have early second century Ignatius of Antioch calling Jesus God. You have the Didache then at the early second century, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. To assume it's talking about a man, which you just
Mm-hmm.
did, is an assumption, but he could be, and you've allowed this possibility actually already, also be referring to Jesus as God, because Ignatius of Antioch, the bishop, who was, I don't know, the third or the fourth from Peter at Ephesus, also called Jesus a God at that same time, and he was a bishop of the
Yeah.
church. So
Yeah.
one couldn't assume a purely human definition, ontology for that, the Son there. The ontology could be divine, in fact, given
Yeah.
that contemporary.
Yeah, divine in a lesser sense. Sure. There were people in the early and mid second century who were speculating about pre-existence. And if
Mm,
you have any kind of pre-existence, then looks like there's going to have to be some addition, unless it was only the soul. But if you think the whole human nature came into existence at some point at or after his conception, if you believe in any kind of pre-existence, there's going to have to be some extra ontological component there so that it's the same person.
mm.
Now about Ignatius, Ignatius is an authenticity nightmare. It's horrific. Okay, all of these books are found with fake books that everybody think are fake. Um, in earlier times, all the Protestants thought that these were fake because he's beating the drum for the one bishop system too early historically. Now, in these latter days, Lightfoot personally has revived the case that there are 7 genuine letters, and conservative scholars like evangelicals love Ignatius because he calls Jesus God. And like, see, that's the deity of Christ right there in the early 100s, which is
Yeah.
an anachronism. One of the things that Lightfoot says is that among the various ways these letters were corrupted, is they insert more Jesus is God statements into them. And he thought this based on looking at some of the translations in other languages. I forget which languages, Armenian maybe or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, we know that these letters were a political football in the fourth century, but I think they were also a political football earlier than that.
They were
Uh,
political, particularly the Reformation, because at that
yeah,
time, before textual critical studies had really developed, it was a much larger corpus of
yeah,
pseudo Ignatian works, and this became a battleground for between Roman Catholics and
Yeah.
Protestants at that time. But
Let me grant, for sake of argument, that the 7 letters are totally genuine, and just take it from there. Okay.
so I'm assuming, because I've not come
Hmm.
across. I mean, I'm not an expert on Ignatius's letters, but what I have read from, say, the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, which is the best, the standard reference work on this
Hmm.
subject, that there are now broadly accepted that the smaller canon of Ignatius work is accepted,
Hmm.
authentic, and the larger one that Luther and Calvin and the others knew about, they are spurious and they're there to be
Yeah.
ignored. But the smaller canon does have the statements that Jesus is God in.
Yes. Yeah. So let's take that. You have to consider things in context.
mm,
Okay. We just talked about earlier that even in the New Testament, even for Second Temple Jews, beings other than God might be addressed as God or referred to as God or gods.
yeah,
This is all over the Old Testament. That's another story.
yeah,
But as time went on, the way I see it, Jews got more and more stingy with their God language, because they more and more were kind of resisting the pagans and wanting to emphasize the uniqueness of Yahweh. And whereas at an earlier time, they would call Yahweh the greatest of the gods, and they would refer to other unseen beings as Elohim, as time goes on, they're very, very stingy with their God language. And that is exactly what you see in the New Testament. um, they're still aware that there's a usage, you could say a secondary usage of God terms, but they're very, very stingy with theos, and it almost always means just God the Father. It's used almost, you know, if they depart from that, it's in a clear instance that they're talking about somebody else. Uh, so now, what happened by the time you get to the 2nd century is you have the Christian movement um, starting to be dominated by Gentiles.
mm,
And I also think you have some law keeping Jews and some more Pauline non law keeping people.
mm,
And Ignatius is in the non law keeping group.
yeah,
And the Gentiles just simply weren't quite as stingy with their God language,
mm,
because they would apply it to emperors and demigods and heroes, and they had these traditional pantheons.
yes,
Some of them were monotheists.
mm,
Some of the pagans were monotheists in that they had a one true God, and all these other were lesser, in some sense, divine beings.
mm, mm,
So it's in this context that you have to look at all this stuff in the 2nd century, where they're calling Jesus our God, my God, God, etc.
mm,
You need to look carefully at when they're talking about the monotheism issue and what they say about the one true God.
mm, mm,
And what you'll find is just what you see reflected in all of the early confessions that you see in writers like Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, even Justin. They believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of the heavens and the earth. And that's an expression of a unipersonal theology.
mm,
Now they'll turn around and call Jesus God, yes, but it's not because they think that there are two who are God. That's a clear misunderstanding.
mm,
And what they'll do when challenged, just speaking generally
mm,
about the theologies that we have from the 100s and the 200s, speaking generally, and this is clearest in the authors for which we have the most. So people like Origen, Tertullian, and Irenaeus, what they do when challenged on monotheism is they don't say, oh yeah, well, Jesus is God and the Father's God, but see, there's really only one God because they're the same God. Or, hey, they're really two persons within one God. Or they're one God because they have the same essence. They don't do any of that stuff. What they do is they emphasize the uniqueness of the Father.
mm, mm.
You see it in Novation, around the same time from Origin as well. So
Yeah,
if you want to know why there's only one God, it's because there's only one, basically underived source of everything else, and that's the Father.
I think you make two actually very interesting points. I would slightly disagree with your first claim that the Jewish vocabulary language about God became more restrictive. It did for a lot of Jews at that time in the 1st and 2nd century, right? Particularly in reaction against the Roman attacks on Judaism and the rise of Christianity. But also we have, the elephant in the room, which is Philo of Alexandria.
Yeah.
He's
The most Hellenized guy,
he's the most
and
Hellenized guy.
coincidentally the loosest with his God talk.
Precisely my point. Now,
Mm-hmm.
he very happily in his commentaries on the Bible, and he wrote a lot of commentaries on the Bible, happily
Yeah.
calls Moses God. Um,
Yeah.
he uses that language without apparent embarrassment because of all the caveats that you'd understand. He's using
Mm-hmm.
quite promiscuous God language very promiscuously. But I think this is the problem that Philo, and he's a Jew, obviously, um, and that seems to me the problem with Christianity as such. We see it to some extent in Judaism with Philo, but later on in the second century as well. That as you say, as the church became a Gentile uh, uh, organization predominantly, and Judaism and Jews became anathematized. You see this even in Justin Martyr, who has very rude things to say about Judaism per se, even though Jesus was a Jew and that was his religion.
He's very tough on them. He's just like one step short of anti-Semitic. Yeah, he's very tough on them, very unsympathetic.
He's not the only one. The Epistle of
Mm-hmm.
Barnabas is another
Yeah.
one, and then you get full orbed. That's the right word. Full on anti-Semitism in Chrysostom,
Yes.
Justin, and so on. But that's a different
Yeah.
subject.
Shockingly so in that period. Mm-hmm.
Shockingly so. And then it's picked up by Luther, and then it's picked up again by the Nazis, and then we have what happened then with the Nazis. So we had this terrible continuity from the early Christians to the Holocaust, I would argue, but that's a different subject. But coming back to the concept of God issue here, because as you rightly say, it became a Gentile organization, and their use of this language about God was much looser and more promiscuous than the more rigidly applied language to God in the emerging Jewish faith post destruction of the temple, AD 70. What we're looking at here is something that is built to fail, Christianity, in as much as it should be have an allegiance to monotheism, or even Tawhid, to use an Islamic term, because now it's in a world of Greek or pagan usage of language, which is anything but disciplined in the Jewish sense or the Islamic sense. They're using divine language of human beings. It becomes part of the liturgy. Trinitarianism is developed, and this seems to me to be, I mean, the Gentilization of the church, and you see it there in Paul in the New Testament, is there from the beginning. It's not just a second century thing, where the separation from the monotheistic roots of Judaism into the Gentile world seems to be a car crash waiting to happen. It just seems a really bad idea. If you go right into the pagan world, you cut yourself off from the only monotheistic religion around at that time. You're asking for trouble, and that's exactly what we see. We see that in the fourth century with the Trinitarian creeds, with Augustine and Anselm, all the way through to the modern era. So I guess my question here is a question of theodicy. What is God from a Christian point of view, from your point of view as a monotheistic Unitarian Christian? What is God doing in all of this? Why did God allow a Gentile church to emerge, which basically betrayed its monotheistic origins, embraced a creed which is, basically tritheistic, commits idolatry by worshiping Jesus and elevates the Holy Spirit to a separate person? What is going on here? Why did God allow the project to fail so catastrophically from an Islamic point of view? The desemiticizing of Jesus was a catastrophe, because then you take away these monotheistic restraints. In terms of theodicy, I guess it's more a question of
Yeah. Well,
what is going on here.
I think we need to be really careful about what happened when and how. And I think some of my Unitarian brethren are a little sloppy about this sometimes. For instance, they see Tertullian using the word Trinitas in the very early 200s, and they're just like, oh, there it is. It all went to hell, so to speak, in that one moment. My own view is that no, the mainstream non-modalistic monarchian Christians, whether they are dynamic monarchians or logos theorists, my view is no, they really are monotheistic. and they are monotheistic because they have only one true God. And then they have these lesser divine beings, which are not God in the same sense. And that really is a kind of monotheism. Um, to believe that the one God is the Trinity, okay, well, if the one God just is the Trinity, that is a kind of monotheism. It's not the New Testament kind, unfortunately. Are there some Trinitarians who are tritheistic? Yes, I think so. Um, and I've written at great length about this. For instance, if you look at my entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the Trinity, I discuss some of these types of views.
Can I just interrupt you there?
I've never said that all of them. Sorry.
So I just want to interrupt you, if I may. Sorry to interrupt. I wanted just to highlight what you've just said, that your
Mm-hmm.
article in the Stanford Encyclopedia, which is available online to read, is
Yep.
excellent. If you really want a rigorous philosophical exposition of the issues and the doctrine of the Trinity and so on, I do recommend readers just Google that and read it, because it's a gem. So thank you for that. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I've never said, like some of my brethren have, who are biblical Unitarians, that all Trinitarians are tritheist, or the quote that the Trinity is incoherent. Um, the Trinitarian tradition, what happened was the empire enforced a bunch of standard language. Even at the time, there wasn't really a clear agreement about how to interpret that language. And so people are just kind of thrown on their own to make the sense of it as best they can. Most
Mm,
people don't make sense of it. Most people are afraid to mess with it
mm,
because they've been threatened that, if you get it wrong, you'll lose your salvation somehow.
yeah.
Just leave this up to the professionals.
Mm,
Okay, well, bad news. The professionals have a bunch of clashing interpretations of this insofar as they have interpretations. Not
yeah.
all the professionals do. Some of them just repeat the language and pound the table and insist it all makes sense, just repeat the same thing again. But when you actually interpret, what do you mean by one ousia? What do you mean by three hypostases? What is it for there to be one God and three persons? You get a bunch of different answers. Some of them are tritheistic. Some of them are incoherent, like they're self-refuting because they're internally self-contradictory. Some of them are not. Some of them are a kind of monotheism. I think you can't really deny that, although then they get into what you would call modalist territory. Um, so it's important to see that they are monotheists in these early times. Even the modalists are monotheists, the ones that foolishly collapse together the Father and Son as if those are the same one.
Oh, yeah.
Well, they've got one God too. Uh, what the Logos theorists did was they started talking about a first God and a second God.
Mm,
And that's fundamentally what their theology is about, which is why some, such as William Lane Craig, they just openly repudiate Logos theory. They're like, this was a terrible misstep.
mm,
You shouldn't be talking about two gods. But the first God is the one true God in the highest sense of the term, the underived origin of all else. And then the second God is something that was originally it was something that was emanated out of God at a certain time, so that God wouldn't have to create directly, but he could create through this intermediary.
mm,
So that's what you see in Justin. By the time you get to Origin Ovation, they're speculating about, hey, if God's really a father, he must eternally have a son. So then there must eternally be this second divine being.
mm, mm,
Um, now, why does God allow all of this craziness? So, well, let me say one more bit about the craziness. The worst thing that I see in the second century, it's not that they gave up their monotheism, it's that they sidelined Jesus Christ. And this is the position of all the apologists, what I'm about to describe. Okay, they're embarrassed that their religion was started by a dead Jew, because these are people in elite sectors of Roman society. Think about people in the ruling class of America or the UK. They're snotty. They think they know everything. They think they know what's best for everybody. That's how the people who were very learned in Greek traditional philosophy kind of were. They thought, hey, we are the truly spiritual minded people here, the real intellectuals, and the hoi polloi, the unwashed masses of dummies. They think what they think, and yeah, they're interested in Jesus, but that's fine. That's for them. But the truly spiritual, such as ourselves, like this is what Origen practically says this, Jesus is there for the kind of fleshly minded people and the Jews. But really spiritual people like myself can discern that really what is important there is the ministry of this logos. So they had a God that was super duper transcendent. This is common to Platonic influenced theologies of that time.
Mm-hmm.
They thought that this God could never become incarnate and could never directly create. Justin says this very clearly in chapter 127 of his dialogue with Trypho. And this logos was supposed to be, it means reason, word, thought. And they kind of thought that this was in some way the source of all reason within humans. And so maybe Plato and the Stoics and Aristotle had some access to the logos, and that's why they can talk about God, and that's why they can be right. So now our religion wasn't started 100 years ago by a dead Jew who got executed for some terrible crime, presumably. Now we can just sort of sideline him. Let's talk about God the Father, and then his amazing logos through which he made the world, like Plato talks about in his cosmology in the Timaeus.
Yeah.
They were all reading this, or were influenced by people who had read it. He says God had to have one who is neither created nor uncreated in order to make the cosmos. It's kind of a chain of being type thing. Like the cosmos is too far down to directly come from God, or for God to have contact with it somehow. It's very odd, right? Why would an omnipotent and omniscient being need a helper to create? It's crazy. Like, why wouldn't he just do it himself if he's really all powerful and all knowing? But anyway, so they love this logos thing. It let them make their religion ancient. It let them try to hijack the Greek philosophers and say, well, they just had some, extra special blessing of the logos, and we're just talking about the same thing they were talking about. They also had a conspiracy theory that Plato stole everything from Moses, which is
Oh, yeah.
ridiculous.
Mm.
But that's what they thought.
Mm.
So they wanted to give credit to the Jewish roots.
Yep.
And so the way that Origen dealt with sidelining Jesus, well, he still had Jesus. He had the eternal divine word assume an entire man. And so he had a Christology that would later be called Nestorian. Same thing with Tertullian.
Mm.
Now, what happened was with the many, with the hoi polloi, was that they heard this talk about two gods, and they're like, what are you talking about? We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, creator of the heavens and the earth. We've never heard about two gods, or worshiping two. Like, we uphold the monarchy of the Father. And some of them were modalists, and some of them were basically biblical Unitarians, but historians call them dynamic monarchians. They think the logos is like God's power, which is in Jesus, basically, John 1. And what the logos theorists did was they defended themselves. In his recently recovered dialogue with Heraclides, which I have a podcast episode on the Trinities podcast where you can hear the relevant portion being read out. Origen says, hey, in one sense we talk about one God, in another sense we talk about two gods. And this first God and second God, we say they're one. Now, they're different gods, yeah, but it says Adam and Eve are one. It says all the believers were one. So there are times when you can take two different things and really say they're one. But it's a manner of speaking, right? He's sort of covering over his view.
Yeah.
What Irenaeus does, which is really irritating to me. I always find Irenaeus irritating because he's such a half-baked theorizer, for one thing.
Well, he lived in the 2nd century. He's not. He doesn't have the benefit of later creeds and councils, does he?
No, but what he does is he is a logos theorist to the T. He's unclear about whether the logos eternally was a second divine being, or whether it emanated out before creation. He's unclear about that, but he totally has the logos theory views about everything. However, he knows that the two gods talk is naughty, and he knows that'll get a reaction, so he avoids it. And so Trinitarians, when they look at Irenaeus, they're like, oh, this is our boy. This is great. He just sounds like a Trinitarian. But when you look really carefully, he has in all of his confessions that the one true God is the Father. When you look really carefully, he thinks that the Son of God does not know the day and the hour, and not just in his human nature, but just flat doesn't know it, period. So he's just a lesser being. Um, and he thinks that, just like the New Testament says, that the Son is an intermediary. Now, I don't want to evade the force of your question. You ask basically, how could God let this happen?
It's a question of theodicy.
Yeah,
I mean, I didn't know that quote about origin. I've not heard that before, so that's actually fascinating. Yeah.
yeah, you can look that up again. It's in a podcast. This was a book that was rediscovered in recent times, so the early modern people don't know about this. It was a council where he was called upon to school this bishop who they thought was some kind of monarchian. And so it's somebody took this down in shorthand, their exchange. And when he says there's two gods, he basically says he can hear the crowd react with horror. And he
Uh,
says, like, hey, I know you're reacting to this, but hey, come on, let's be sophisticated here. In one sense, we have two. In one sense, we have one God. He's very consistent about this, and he's very shy with the two gods language, but he does use it in his book Against Celsus, which
right.
is very, very revealing of what his views actually are, because it's not
He was seen
corrupted by
later, of course,
prejudice.
as a bit of a heretic. So he's not an orthodox standard bearer according to later church theology.
Yeah,
Uh,
there's that complication, but he was like, he was the lead boy number one in his day.
oh,
Like,
it's a top scholar.
yeah, absolute tip top, no comparison with anybody in early Christianity. And he was still the big influence at in the fourth century. They
Mm.
were all disciples of Origen.
So what
Um,
was God doing in a church that I think quite early on basically was using language in such an irresponsible way that it inevitably, really, in a Gentile world, led
yeah,
to the worship of beings other than the one true God. And the point is, there's assumption here, there's perhaps a more Catholic or Pauline assumption that the church is the body of Christ, according to Paul's theology. It's not
yeah,
just a human institution, it's a divine institution. So it's supposed to be maintained as such throughout history by God himself. There's
yeah,
a level of indefectibility about that. I don't know if that's a view you share, but in terms of mainstream Christian thought, the church is not, Jesus founds the church on Peter, and the gates of hell will not prevail against you. It is indefectible.
yes,
It's not
yes.
going to
So
completely apostatize, given that
yeah,
promise from the.
see, I don't think they apostatized.
Ah,
And my view, I take of it, is a little gentler. Why does God allow this? I don't know. Why did God allow the Jews to go astray as much as he did? So you have all these different wild sects in Jesus' time. I don't know. In general, it seems like he allows us to mess things up. And if you're Protestant, this is just one of many big errors that occur fairly early. You have the worship and honor of saints and Mary. You have the idea that a person is saved by baptism. You have the one bishop system. I think the one bishop system was the biggest early mistake. That turned out it was a human expedient to control the heretics and sort of standardize things. And I think it turned out very badly, because in the fourth century, this ruling class
yeah, it
seized the
weaponized
power for
the
determining
empire. Yeah,
they
when it's
seized the power for determining doctrinal questions for themselves. But the reason I don't think the gates of hell prevailed against it is, if you look at things like the Apostles' Creed,
mm,
which are embraced by all Christian groups, they are, in fact, teaching the gospel that you see in Acts, that
mm.
Jesus is the Son of God, the Son of the Creator, the one true God. He came as the greatest revealer of God. He was raised from the dead and exalted, and he's now an intermediary with God. He's still active today, through God's Spirit and believers in Him. And so, uh, what happened was, God, in my view, God allowed, he did preserve that message. In fact, it's there right along the whole time, if we're talking about anything but Gnostics. And the question is, why did he allow all of these other things to be glommed on together with it? And I don't really know. They
Okay,
don't, people are not necessarily consistent. You might think, well, the theory that the one true God is the Trinity clashes with the one true God being the Father alone. Yes, it does. But as Trinitarian theologians frequently lament, the average Trinitarian in the pew, is a mere monotheist most of the time. And the reason for that is because they read the Bible. And they get into Jesus is one character and God's another, and they're talking to each other, and God vindicates him and so on. And Jesus is a mediator. So even while you're Trinitarian, you're still sort of operating instinctively in this non-Trinitarian way, insofar as you're biblically oriented.
Do you think that? Do you think, in from your understanding, in God's purposes, you said you're agnostic, you don't know, which is fine, of course. How can one know for sure about these things? But would you perhaps perceive a role for the advent of Islam as a corrective to the early church, or the sixth, seventh church going off the rails when it comes to Mary as the mother of God, Jesus being
Yeah,
the second person of the Trinity? Islam was
that's yeah,
phenomenally successful at that time, and brought great pressure. I mean, it gobbled up the eastern part of the Christian world, or all those centers of Christianity: Jerusalem, Ephesus,
yeah.
Galatia, and so on. In your perspective, in terms of God's providence in the world, what was God
Hmm.
taking the church up to, saying, "Look, monotheism, Tawhid,
Yeah,
Tawhid"? Do you
yeah,
see that?
yeah. It's very possible. I mean, and I think historical perspective is really revealing here. Um, Islam, as it stands, mainstream Islam, is by far the greatest inoculation against mainstream Christianity that has ever existed. They swallowed up half the Christian world practically, and they had a perfect system by which they would tolerate the religion of their conquered peoples, but with a secondary, second class citizen status and a high tax and so on. They had a way of tolerating just enough to strangle it out completely over the centuries. So countries that used to be Eastern Christian have for a long time been 99% Muslim. And the mainstream Christian message has never ever anywhere made big inroads against Islam.
Mm.
So it's like a tailor-made defeater. They're like, how can you take Mary as an additional God? Well, that's not the official Catholic doctrine, but you can just look and see people bowing to statues of Mary. So in a sense, there is a kind of worship going on there and a kind of idolatry.
Yeah.
I don't think the Quran really gets the Trinity quite right, but it looks like it's a reaction against it. Now, the way the Eastern Christians perceived the Islamic invasion in the 7, 8, 900s was nobody saw it coming. They saw it completely out of the blue. They were devastated by it. They figured it must be God's judgment on them. They never heard of this guy before, and all of a sudden he's their the Muslims are their overlords. And could it have been God chastising them? Yeah, I suppose. Um,
Not just
and
chastised.
every Islamic apologist, the very first thing they bring up is Trinity. Even if they're a 12-year-old boy, they're like, "Ha ha, this doesn't make sense." And the second thing they bring up is the incarnation. Ha ha, that doesn't make any sense. You think God goes to the bathroom, and they're not impressed by the traditional answer. They don't know the traditional answers typically, but I can't really blame them for that because the traditional answers are super convoluted, and most Christians don't know the official answers either.
No,
But I think they're right to not be impressed. But you have Islamic scholars, very learned men, going back to the Middle Ages, basically just quoting the New Testament against the Christians. Didn't make much of a dent, because it was so tradition based and not as much New Testament based. But they would say, "Hey, look, your own books have Jesus worshiping somebody, and God is somebody and Jesus is somebody else, and there's no Trinity stuff in here. Where would you get the idea that Jesus is all powerful and all knowing from what's said in the Gospels?" These are all good points.
So would you accept that Muhammad was a prophet in the sense that he was sent by God to proclaim pure monotheism, Tawhid, in the Jewish sense, in the sense that it is essentially the same concept of God? Could you accept
No,
that is the case?
no. If he's God's instrument, I think he's God's instrument more like Cyrus the Great was.
He was a Messiah. Cyrus the Great was called the Messiah in Isaiah.
Yeah, that's right. God's anointed for a certain purpose to
Yep.
chastise his people. But you wouldn't endorse his teaching and his theology based on that.
But Muhammad's
I
teaching theology as regards concept
yeah,
of God, monotheism on this particular part. Now, I know there are other things, of course, that Muhammad taught, but on this one issue we're talking about,
yeah,
you don't
yeah.
disagree with what Muhammad said, do you? You think Muhammad was right on his concept of God, do you not?
I do think he was in a sense right that God is a single self.
Hmm.
And that the God and that was the type of God that was taught by the Jews and Christians before. But with respect to him being a prophet, I'm really stuck in the same exact place as the Jews and the Christians of his day.
Hmm.
He tried to convince lots of Jews and Christians that he was a prophet, and they just didn't buy it. And part of the reason they didn't buy it was because they didn't see sufficient, kind of verifying miracles. And I don't see that as well. And when I look at the early history and the Hadith and so on, um, I don't think he's the worst person in the world, but I think he's not exactly impressing me with his godly qualities.
Hmm.
He's acting like an ancient ruler. He
Like,
gets an extra
like,
share. He
like,
gets an extra share of the booty, an extra share of the women, and
like,
that,
like, like Moses, perhaps, who was a military leader, a general, a head of state, a prophet.
yeah, or like David, he has plenty of blood on his hands. Not a Jesus type of character.
No,
To,
no. But,
yeah.
but if Moses is a prophet and David is called a prophet as well in the New
Mhm.
Testament, why would that? What's the defeater, the disqualification point then about Muhammad? Because he's in that tradition of
Yeah.
prophets, which you've already said are like that.
The disqualifier, I think, and I think this is really the clash between Christianity and Islam, and I think all the stuff about Trinity and incarnation is a sideshow.
Hmm.
The real clash is that both of them claim to be the last and greatest revealer of God's will to humankind, and they can't both be because the law, as it's developed in Islamic tradition, is not compatible with discipleship to Jesus. And so,
Is it,
because Jesus was the last and greatest revealer, I don't think Muhammad was. I don't think he was predicted. Um, I think he took advantage of a situation where people had these, kind of backwards pagan views, and his monotheism made a lot more sense, and his anti-idolatry stance made more sense, and he managed to gain power gradually and through a lot of hard fighting.
hmm.
But I don't see the kind of vindication. His one miracle, in his day, people said, "Okay, you're a prophet. What kind of miracles has God done to put His divine mark of endorsement on you?" And he said, "Well, my miracle is these beautiful verses."
Hmm.
And I'm not like many. I'm not impressed by that miracle. And there are later miracles attributed to him in the Hadith, flying through the night and splitting the moon and so forth. But I
Yeah.
don't. Those are untrustworthy, very late reports. So
I think just coming back to this point about Jesus and Moses, sorry,
mhm.
Jesus and Muhammad again.
Yeah.
My understanding, and this is changing the subject completely, so I don't want to necessarily get sidetracked, but my understanding of history is that Jesus himself, the historical Jesus, was a Torah observant Jew, and that he hadn't come
Yes.
to abolish the law. Now, he
Hmm.
certainly interpreted the law in a unique way or a different way, say, than from the Pharisees or whatever, the scribes. But nevertheless, he wasn't outside of the boundaries of Judaism in having his own and particular interpretation of the law. Um, Later followers, we mentioned Ignatius of Antioch, were very anti-Jewish, and therefore, in my understanding, anti-Jesus, because they de-Semiticized him, Judaized him, and taken away the law that he himself, according to Matthew anyway, which I think is historically authentic, has him as a Torah observant Jew. Now, if one looks at the Halakha, the Jewish law, and the Sharia, I'm impressed by some extraordinary convergences in both in a conceptual level, the way the law is understood vis-a-vis society and the believer's obedience to God, but also
Hmm.
in the rulings to do with relationships between men and women and gender and so is extraordinary convergence in many ways. And they are almost identical twins when it comes to not just the concept of God, but also the application of that in divine law, regulating society, human relations, and also
Yeah. Yeah.
vertic.
We know that he had contact with Jews and
Yeah.
Christians.
So, so
Um,
So
in his caravan work earlier in his life when he was
yeah.
married to his first wife. Hmm.
So the point would be then that Muhammad, if one is comparing him to Jesus, now of course Jesus wasn't a head of state. He didn't go to war. He wasn't in that context where he had to, like Moses was, for example, fight
Hmm.
to keep the religion alive, to keep the faith going. But nevertheless, in terms of the more religious side of practicing a religion based on not so much on creed and belief, but more on praxis rather than creed,
Yeah.
the theology seems to be much more the Jewish emphasis and the Islamic emphasis. Christian theology, as such, seems to be a peculiarly Christian phenomena. The
Hmm.
Jewish and Islamic praxis is much more emphasized on law, so law
Yeah.
code practice. So there seem to be, and these similarities have been noticed by Hans Kung, of course, the great German writer who's written a book on this very subject. He's the Catholic theologian from Tübingen. The reason I mention this is the similarities between Jesus and Muhammad, in the sense that I have described, are much greater than a superficial comparison would suggest dissimilarities. Jesus wasn't married, Muhammad was. Jesus wasn't head of state, well, Muhammad was. But there are other, in terms of their religious practice, they seem to be very similar, I would suggest. And Jewish Christianity, going right back to the early first century, seems to have a lot in common with Islam, and this has been noted by the New Jerome Biblical Commentary. They actually said that Jewish Christianity was reborn, quote unquote, as Islam. Hans Kung, the German theologian, I said,
Yeah.
mentioned the similarity as well. Keith
There's
Ward,
similarity. I mean,
there are many similarities,
he
but
knew
the
about the Jewish precedent. Yeah.
similarities are not just similarities, they're also contrasts with the later Christian faith. You get dissimilarities, discontinuities with Pauline Christianity and the rising emergent Catholic faith in the second and third century onwards, which
Yeah.
is actually quite different from the Jesus Muhammad understanding. So the irony then is that Islam has preserved the early Christian Jewish Jesus faith much better than the later Catholic Christianity, which I know you're not defending, has done. And this is, and there's one German scholar who called this the greatest irony in history, that Islam had preserved this and Christianity has not. And so the continuities between Jesus and Muhammad are multiple. And often not acknowledged in scholarship, in fact, although they're beginning to be noticed by some scholars that I'm reading.
Well, yeah, he had contact with Jews, with particularly three tribes in the Arabian Peninsula, and he had contact with some kind of Christians. We know about this. But again, if you're a believer in New Testament type Christianity, Jesus is the complete deal breaker when it comes to Islam. And the reason is that the Quran gets Jesus wrong, according to us. Right? It's strong. It seems to insist, there's one passage which is traditionally interpreted to insist that he actually didn't die on a cross. And so that's a mainstream Islamic teaching, whereas a central New Testament teaching is that, yes, he died on the cross and that this was a once and for all sacrifice for human sin. That's a very big, important part of his role.
True.
Another big thing it disagrees, it gets him wrong in many ways. It seems to suggest it seems to presuppose that, he came as a prophet, and like all prophets, he brought a book like Muhammad did. And the book he brought was the gospel, which, no, he didn't write anything. Um, that's not right. But most importantly, I think, is Jesus's current position, because the New Testament doctrine is that Jesus was killed. He voluntarily went to become this sacrifice, this once and for all sacrifice, thus making further temple sacrifice unnecessary. And then he was raised from the dead, made immortal by God, and raised to God's right hand, which puts him as the second most powerful being in the universe under God. It's like God's kind of plenipotentiary, to use an older
Yeah,
term. He's like Joseph to Pharaoh in Genesis.
it's a good analogy.
And uh, the New Testament is not shy about Jesus receiving religious worship. This is the very thing that Islam suggests is always, kind of blasphemous, to associate anybody with God as just this unforgivable sin. Well, the New Testament doctrine is that, Jesus, everyone will bow to Jesus, and this will be to the glory of God the Father, Philippians 2.
Yeah.
And you have this vision of heavenly worship. It's a vision of the exaltation of Jesus in Revelation 5. So all Christians, whatever their Christology, even the Socinians, even the dynamic monarchians, basically all Christians, you can find a few wingnut Unitarians who disagree. They all worship Jesus.
mm,
Now, not as God, like confusing together Jesus and God, or worshiping Jesus as the, as the unique creator and so on. But no, worshiping him like it says in Revelation 5 because of his unique service to God.
mm,
And then part of this is being in charge of the church, and part of it is being an intermediary between God and humankind.
mm.
And
Yeah,
that this
I,
role is,
I
even
think you're
though
right.
Islam
There
will
is.
say that he is the Christ and was a prophet, they deny him these two very important roles that I just described.
No, you're right that difference exists, and it's certainly there in the New Testament. I don't doubt that for a second. I think a response might be is that there are two things here that are being fused into one. One is the gospel of Jesus. That we can see Jesus preached in the earlier synoptic tradition. So in Mark chapter 1, Jesus is preaching the Injil, the gospel. And then there's a gospel about Jesus, which is something that Paul proclaims. I'm not saying Paul invented Christianity, but he's the dominant voice in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
The message that the gospel is, as he says in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3, that Jesus, I pass on to you what I myself received, that Jesus died for your sins according to the scriptures, rose, and so on. Now, the gospel that Jesus preached is quite different. There are two different gospels, in my view. This has not been noticed by me. This goes back, 1.5 centuries to Termingen in Germany, as was noticed. But the gospel
I
that
think they're consistent, but can keep going.
yeah, I don't. I think they're radically. I think they're almost different religions, and this is where Islam comes in at the Achilles heel, I think, of the Christian faith, because the gospel. If you take Luke's gospel, for example, the gospel that Jesus preaches. So I'm putting on one side here for the moment, Revelation, a book of Revelation, Paul, or anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
According to Luke, the gospel that Jesus preaches is very Islamic. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that God's mercy and God's invitation to salvation and so on doesn't have a mediator. It doesn't have a man as a mediator between God and man. God deals directly with people. His forgiveness is offered freely. It doesn't require a sacrifice on the cross, a human sacrifice or a temple sacrifice. The parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15 is a paradigmatic parable, that's an expression, of this soteriology, where God freely welcomes back the sinner in the parable without any sacrifice, without any
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
intermediary involved, and this is this is normal in Luke's presentation of Jesus's gospel. If you mention, as people often do, the Lord's Supper issue in Luke, and this is a highly controversial area where the textual issues are very fraught and very kind of argued about. There seems to be some textual corruption and in that in the way it's normally translated in the Bible today. Bart Ehrman has discussed this amongst others at some length. But in terms of Jesus preaching, we see this in John the Baptist in Mark chapter 1, where John is portrayed as in Mark chapter 1,
Mm-hmm.
earliest gospel, Mark chapter 1. John the Baptist is preaching a gospel of repentance for the forgiveness of sins, and people go into the River Jordan and receive the baptism, this Jewish rite of symbolic purification, and their sins are forgiven. Now, given what I've just said, that gospel of John the Baptist, that gospel of Jesus, have none of the later Pauline themes of Jesus' death on the cross of salvation for our sins as a requirement, as a prerequisite for forgiveness of sins at all. It's much more Islamic, as I say, in this free forgiveness of God without mediator, without sacrifice being required.
Yeah.
All that can happen.
Well,
So
let me say something about that.
this distinction between the gospel of Jesus, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
talking about John here, of course, John's gospel, I mean, because I see that as a later interpretation where, John 3:16 is not a response. And not that you're going to do that, but it's not a response for me. I'm seeing it as going back to the earlier Jesus tradition, is very Islamic in its soteriology, its understanding of the law vis-a-vis the halakha or the Sharia, and is very dissimilar to what Paul preached and what the later church emerged into preaching, a gospel about Jesus. And that's a fundamentally different religion, I would argue.
Yeah, Jesus's message in the synoptics is that the kingdom of heaven is here and it's available to you, and repentance is what's required.
Exactly.
And he he does, even in the synoptics. If you want to be skeptical about John, let's talk about the synoptics. He does predict his own death, even a sacrificial death. And it's always been the Christian view that Jesus was still active spiritually in the early church, and there was kind of more to it. The time wasn't quite right for the entire thing um, to be known at that time. So, yeah, he was born under the law and he had to live according to it. All his arguments with the Jews are about quite how to interpret the law and kind of what the spirit is behind it and so on.
Yeah.
Um, and and yet there's some hints too that there's going to be more coming. I mean, the view you see in the New Testament is, it's not that you have to be careful here to separate later speculations about atonement from what the New Testament actually says. So there are a lot of speculations later to the effect that God just simply can't forgive unless somebody takes the full punishment on behalf of everybody.
Yeah.
Which is very strange. What was he doing all those years forgiving Jews, with just a lousy bull or a dove or something like this being killed as a sacrifice? The sacrifice doesn't really strictly pay for it. It doesn't like adequately compensate God for what he's lost. It's just a symbolic kind of token loss. When you sin, you've wasted part of your life, and God's never going to get that back, right? What's been done has been done. And so he's always just going to have to kind of eat the cost, really. It's not that he's really being paid for it in some sense. Plus, if he was being fully paid, you may think as well, it's not forgiveness at all. Because if you're fully paid, then it's nothing has been forgiven.
Exactly.
Um, so what believing in Jesus is necessary for, I think, in the New Testament isn't forgiveness, period, because there's lots of people who never heard of Jesus. What it's necessary for is to get in on this new covenant, this new deal. And there is a new deal, and it's supposed to be superior to the old deal and involve, a greater extent of spiritual empowerment. Whereas before, the prophets are few and far between. He's now pouring out his spirit on all flesh, Acts says, based on Joel. And it's even Christ pouring out God's spirit to them from his exalted position. And so more widely, you see these spiritual gifts being distributed, and the kind of power that's available to people under this new deal is quite different than under the old, but it's the same God. Now, when you say all this sounds Islamic, I mean, like, that's kind of an anachronism. It's just Jewish. It's because Judaism and Islam are both law-based systems,
Yeah.
and clearly, in some sense, Judaism was a major part of the inspiration for Muhammad bringing a law, and trying to, like the theocratic Jewish state. He brought not just a religion in the modern sense, but he brought a total everything system, the government's included. It's a theocratic system of government and law and religion and belief. It's all wrapped into one package, and it's a big package, and it's a very appealing package in many ways, which is why Islam is the second biggest religion in the world.
But it's a package that Jesus accepted and practiced according to Matthew's gospel, Matthew 23, when he advised his disciples
Well,
and
but
followers.
we say that you're collapsing the Mosaic tradition with the Islamic tradition.
I'm saying the
But
same.
there's 5 centuries difference between them, right? More than five centuries.
In one sense, you're right. I'm being anachronistic, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking beyond the history to the spiritual and theological principles involved. So yeah, I take your point. I am being anachronistic, but it is to illustrate the deeper continuities between the two religions. That one is the continuity of the other, but Christianity, as it later became, exhibits profound discontinuities with the religion of Jesus. As we see,
Yeah.
this anachronism, by the way, is something spotted by, as I say, the New Jerusalem Biblical Commentary, which is an
Mm-hmm.
official Roman Catholic, publication on the Bible. It says that Islam, that the early Jewish faith of the early church was reborn as Islam in the 7th century. Now, I know what they mean because they're seeing this is in Matthew's gospel. There's a commentary on Matthew chapter and the Sermon on the Mount. I know what they mean, and they make a good point. And I think Jesus was much more Islamic than he was a Christian in terms of his faith and practice. He was a Torah observant Jew. Muhammad was a was a halakha, a Sharia observant Muslim, if you like. But they are, as I say, extremely similar. And thus, if people are attracted to Jesus today, and they want to live in the way that Jesus lived, what would Jesus do? Has the famous American, then Islam is the natural choice, not Christianity, because that's how Jesus lived. That's what he preached. That's what he practiced, not Pauline Christianity, which I think, which he says in Ephesians 2:15, that the law has been abolished, which is the
Right.
opposite.
Well, okay, but now this matter of the law being abolished, this is probably the most difficult issue in understanding the New Testament and the very earliest Christianity. And so there are a lot of arguments to be had here about quite what's going on in Acts,
Yeah,
the difference between Peter and Paul and all that.
yeah.
But to consider Muhammad as the true successor of Jesus. Look, even in the synoptics, you have Jesus claiming that basically God's going to appoint him to judge the world,
Mm.
and that he's going to die this sacrificial death, that he's going to be raised and exalted. How can David call him his Lord? Well, the answer is because he's going to be made Lord in Christ. Um,
But the answer to
and
that
so with with
is
the with the implied sort of mediation, so it's profoundly contrary to Jesus, even in the synoptics.
I think many historians would argue, for good reasons, and I agree with them, that the passion predictions in the synoptics, and I'd actually done a video on this, are more likely to have been read back into the ministry of Jesus by the evangelists, because historically they don't make any sense. You have these very detailed predictions on the lips of Jesus to his disciples, and then when it actually happens, when the arrest and so on, and the death and the resurrection, no one knows anything about it, and these look suspiciously like retrospective insertions into to give the story, the whole narrative, some credibility.
Yeah, well,
It didn't happen to Jesus unexpectedly. Oh no, no, he knew all along it was going to happen because he said so on this occasion, this occasion, this occasion. But you still had the incongruity of the disciples when it actually happens, knowing absolutely nothing. And then you have the bizarre story of a woman coming from the empty tomb, going to Peter in Luke, saying, "No, the tomb's empty." And Peter says, uses the Greek word meaning to the woman, "Do not talk nonsense, woman." Now, it's not nonsense if he has been repeatedly warned in great detail of exactly what is going to happen. And this strikes many people as evidence of a made-up story, shall we say, to try and kind of give a nice, smooth, providential feel to the whole biography of Jesus. Oh no, he wasn't really arrested unexpectedly. It was always going to happen, and Jesus said it was going to happen.
yeah.
Even
Well,
though no one
this
expected
is a skeptical modern perspective, although notice we've now slipped away from treating Jesus as some kind of prophet who would know kind of what his ultimate mission was. About the disciples seeming not to know it, I
it.
mean, the way it's presented is they didn't want to hear it. They were all excited about him being the future king of Israel, and they expected him to bring in the kingdom literally,
Mm.
right? Can we sit on thrones beside you, please?
Yeah.
They think this is about to go down. And so, even though he had told them about this, they kind of didn't know what to do. What is he speaking metaphorically or something? They kind of put it out of their minds in a sense. They didn't want to hear it, but they recalled all this when they were shocked to find him alive again afterwards. Now,
Shocked.
if
Why
you're
were they? Why
skeptical
were
in
they
general
shocked?
of miracles, you can be skeptical about that as well.
Why were they
But
shocked? Why were they shocked if they
because
had
they
been?
thought he was going to bring in the kingdom,
No, but I mean,
whether he's going to be killed, they might have still thought that, but maybe this is after he brings in the kingdom,
no, but
like reviving the Davidic
I meant passion
monarchy,
predictions. I wasn't
basically.
talking about kingdom here. I was talking about his death and resurrection. The kingdom is
Hmm.
different. There were repeated, detailed passion predictions that Jesus would rise from the dead, according to the synoptics,
Hmm.
which many
Hmm.
historians look skeptically on, not because they are post-Enlightenment skeptics, but because the story doesn't cohere as a credible narrative, given that the women went to the tomb. Why did they go to the tomb if he's going to be raised from the dead? When it actually happened, no one expected it to happen, including Peter, who did understand. You say the not understanding is only in one gospel. I think that's definitely in Mark, but in other gospels like Luke, they do understand. And Jesus says that it's clear they do understand what has been said. But
Yeah, God forbid that this should happen. Like they're
yeah,
against it. They view it as a defeat. Like they couldn't view it as anything but a defeat from their
why?
perspective.
But why? If the
Mhm.
resurrection was going to happen,
Because the
yeah.
Messiah brings the kingdom back.
Hmm. So
That's why, and they didn't know there was supposed to be a gap. This is what Christians have always thought. You know, there's a gap between the first part of his ministry and the latter part. Well, he will literally come back and rule. So it's not that it won't happen; it's that there was going to be a separation in time there. Um, he's literally the king. He literally will rule the world from Jerusalem, just not
yeah,
yet.
no, that's certainly there in Matthew very clearly. You're right, but I think I remain unpersuaded. You see, I don't see the Gospels as factual narratives. I see them as expressions of the faith of the early Christians, the authors of the whoever the authors were. I don't know who they were, and so there is some element of invented sayings. We see that in the nativity narratives. You know, where Matthew has Jesus go off to Egypt, so that's very probably not historical. It's created to give a semblance, a parallel of, like Moses, Jesus, or like Jesus, Moses went off to came out of Egypt. You have midrash, you have fiction, as well as historical reminiscence. And I think the passion predictions, because they don't quite make sense in the narrative, are almost certainly also invented. That's not because, oh, how can I say it because he was a prophet? Because you can have invented sayings attributed to a prophet. Many
Yeah.
false hadiths, for example, have been well known, are falsely attributed to Muhammad and have been shown to be such for various reasons. So I
Hmm.
can't, but so my view is that Luke also had this problem because even though in Mark's gospel, Mark 10:45, where on the lips of Jesus, he predicts his death as a sacrifice, the Son of Man will die as a ransom for many. That's Mark 10:45. In Luke's version, because he used Mark in the writing of his gospel, he omits that verse, he deletes it quite deliberately because his soteriology is not the same as Mark's. Luke doesn't think, I don't think, that Jesus died as a sacrifice, as atonement for sin, which is Paul's doctrine. Maybe he saw him as a martyr who died a righteous martyr's death in Luke, but he doesn't agree with Mark because he deletes those passages which present him as a ransom in a Pauline sense. So I think the New Testament is not harmonious on this. It's a library of books with different views. They sometimes contradict each other. Matthew's Jesus contradicts Paul's Jesus when it comes to the law, for example. This is freely admitted in the commentaries, the New Jerusalem Biblical Commentary, for example, talks about the New Testament disagreeing on penultimate matters. So on secondary issues, the New Testament is in contradiction. So one has to dig deeper into the historical sources to find out, if we can, what really happened. And I think Jesus was a Torah observant Jew who did not see his death as a sacrifice for sin. That's a later Pauline idea. It's there in Mark for sure and Matthew, but Luke doesn't think it is. Luke deletes that idea and has Jesus
Well, later,
as
yeah. I mean,
prophet.
later we're talking the difference between the 20s and 30s and the 50s. So
So I think,
that's not much later.
no, but I think
Paul, and we know Paul was
Jesus
hobnobbing
is
with
a
the other
prophet.
apostles as
Yeah.
well.
I would say, sorry,
So
Luke, just to
it's
finish.
hard to find room for these kind of developmental. You're giving me a kind of Ermanesque view of the New Testament where you're strongly emphasizing the differences.
That's
Uh,
not Ehrman, by the way. That goes back to the beginning of the 1800s. If you look at
yeah,
New Testament scholarship, this goes back to Schweitzer, Weiss. It goes back to
yeah.
Bolt. It goes back to the great Scott. But Ehrman is simply a modern incarnation interpreter of that. But I will say, in Luke's gospel, Jesus is presented as a prophet of God who
Hmm.
teaches on his.
More than that, as the Son of God because of his miraculous conception.
Yeah,
For
but
this reason, he will be called the Son of God.
Son of God in the metaphorical sense, not in the hard metaphysical sense that it came to be in Christianity later on. And
Not
there's
in
no,
the sense of having a divine essence. No.
exactly. So
Yeah.
Adam is called in Luke chapter 3 in the genealogy goes right back to Adam, and Adam is called the Son of God in
Hmm.
the Bible.
Hmm.
So, Jesus is like Adam, and that's exactly what the Quran says. If you want to call him Son of God, fine, but in the metaphorical sense of being specially blessed or chosen by God, not in the Christian sense of being the only begotten Son of God, which we see in John chapter 1, which
Well,
is
those aren't the only two options, a purely metaphorical versus having the divine essence derivatively. I think the view that's in Matthew and Luke that's presupposed is that God miraculously caused Mary to become pregnant. And so there are two sources for Jesus, God and Mary, just like there are two sources for people like me and you.
the
And
Quran says
so
the same thing. The Quran,
it's not that God had intercourse with Mary, but he's like the substitute for the Father. And I think that's what Luke is saying. He refers to that which is begotten in her. That's just her becoming pregnant, although miraculously.
no, I agree.
But it's consistent with being a man, I think, because he's still in the lineage of the human race.
Exactly. Well, the Quran says the same thing about the birth of Jesus. The birth of Jesus is miraculous in the sense that Adam's creation was miraculous. They are both actions of God.
Yeah.
They're not incarnation, they are miracles.
But it roundly blasts saying that God in any sense has a son, although he might be assuming the pagan view that, God took a human form and had sex with a woman. That may be what he's blasting, but that's just one of the many things he doesn't seem to get straight from his perspective. He doesn't have good information about what's going on in early Christianity. He's got some notions that he's picked up along the way in the early 600s, but it's not terribly accurate. It's not terribly accurate about what Jesus was up to.
I think it's much more accurate. This has been noticed by people like American New Testament scholars, Jeffrey Butts and I forget the other guy's name now, but two New Testament scholars who've noticed the extraordinary convergence between early Christian understanding of Jesus and the Quran's understanding of Jesus. And these are two New Testament scholars. They're not Muslims. They're both public Christians. One's ordained in the Lutheran Church.
That's because the Quranic view derives from the Christian view that he's God's Christ and a prophet and a real man.
But then the Quran,
that's why the convergence.
Oh, well, in that case, a Muslim could agree with that, because the Quran claims not to be bringing something new, but to simply restate and reaffirm the truth of that which came before. So it's not trying to be novel and produce interesting doctrines. It's trying to restate the truth. So yes, in that sense, that would be plausible, I think.
Yeah, it's not trying to be novel, maybe in a sense, but it's aggressively demoted Jesus from the New Testament view in terms of being a sacrifice and now being the unique mediator between God and man and being a legitimate object of worship.
Yes,
the glory of God. Yeah, it's dead against those things.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's against the New Testament view you've given it. You're absolutely right. And but in terms of the earliest Jewish tradition, as has been noted by prominent Catholic and Lutheran and other scholars, there is this convergence in Christology between the original Jesus tradition and the Islamic tradition. That's what Christian scholars have said. And Keith Ward, Regis Professor at Divinity at Oxford, has said the same in his book as well. So this is being noticed more and more. And I think there's actually been a little bit of a Islamophobic conspiracy of silence about this, because the semblances are so striking that but they're not really made that known, because it is uncomfortable to have Jesus and Islam together in one camp over against later Christian understandings. That doesn't fit well with a Western kind of narrative of Jesus being a Westerner and Islam being an alien other. So I think there's an element of that going on in the background. And again, that's not just my view. That's been said by some Christian scholars as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Muslim people are being sincere when they say, "Hey, we respect Christ. We think he's a great figure," and so on. Although I think they're maybe not too clear about what the New Testament really demands in terms of discipleship to Jesus and sort of what his current position is. And I think there's a kind of naive corruption theory that just whenever you see anything in the Bible that conflicts with Islamic understanding, well, it must have been messed up and corrupted somehow, which I think is untenable. I don't think that's exactly what you're saying. You're giving a very sophisticated modern view. Let's let all the books speak for themselves. Let's not smooth over the differences. Let's admit there are contradictions.
Yes.
I think you have to admit there are some contradictions. This is why I don't sign on to inerrancy as understood by modern evangelicals. There's just some differences in fact here. Somebody, at most, one of these guys has got it right about some of these factual matters. But you have to keep in mind the genre. I think the order of events, I think the exact dialogue were understood to be tools in the author's hands, basically. But I don't think that they were sort of being careless or had no concern with getting the story right. I think, in that sense, I think you can call them biographies as long as you don't import later ideas of inaccuracy into that. They're
Yeah,
ancient biographies.
exactly. The ancient biographies,
You,
which would have meant that they would have incorporated, they would have been creative,
yeah,
incorporated midrash and stories. They wouldn't have been like a modern biography of, I don't know, of a famous person
yeah.
today.
They want you to understand this guy's importance, and they want scenes, probably scenes based on reality, but they can be molded.
Yeah,
They want scenes which give him a chance to show his greatness in words or in action.
yeah. And
Um,
no, I agree. I think just to say that for Muslims, the New Testament is not the Injil. The Injil, according to the Quranic understanding of prophetology and wahi, revelation, the Injil was given to Jesus, as I think you already alluded, and you get this sense even in the New Testament, which
I
is a
think it's presupposed to be a book, though.
I don't know if it's supposed to be a book or not, a written text, or it could be. You see,
Hmm.
originally the Quran was not a written text.
Yeah.
It was an oral recitation. That's what the word Quran means in Arabic. It means
Yes. Yep.
recitation. Muhammad was
Yep.
illiterate. That's traditionally understood. So
Yep.
he didn't walk around with the Quran. He memorized it. And so if that is an analogy for the previous prophets, and that usually is understood, then Jesus could have been given the revelation, the wahi, in that form, and not necessarily in a codex which you would have carried around and shown people. I think that in our literary culture, maybe we just assume that is the case. But I do come back to this different. The New
What do
Testament
you what
today.
do you make since you're bringing up the nature of the Quran and Muhammad as a prophet and so on? What do you make about this early report about one of his secretaries? I can't remember his name, a young guy who was one of his secretaries who would write down his written revelations.
Yeah.
And the report is that sometimes he would suggest an amendment to the verse, and Muhammad, oh yeah, that's yes, that's what's written, or that's better, and he would go along with it.
Mm.
And eventually, the guy became disillusioned. Like, this guy's not really a prophet. I don't think he's really getting these from God, and he ran away.
That's right.
And my memory is that when Mecca was taken, he was basically on the kill list, but somehow somebody who had a sway with Muhammad intervened, and he ended up getting away. You know what I'm talking about? Do you remember the
Yeah,
name of this person?
I remember this story without. You need to find out the name of this person and to really, nail it down, because the moment. But my story is the first part of what you said is the case, that he
Mhm.
apostatized, he left and went away, but then he
Yeah,
did come back.
he was captured
And
when Mecca was taken. He was captured, and then but he
mm,
managed to get away somehow without being
I'd heard
executed.
that this is where maybe a different story, but the story
Mhm.
I've heard, he did come back and ultimately he was reconciled to Muhammad. It's an interesting story. I need to look into it.
I
Yeah,
don't remember the last bit. You might be right about that. I'm not denying it. There would have been a lot of reasons to come back. He was the ascendant power at that point in the Arabian Peninsula.
true. But he chose
But
to come back apparently of his own free will. But I need to
mhm.
find out the name of the individual and look into this in detail, because at the moment we neither of us seem to be able to recall the name.
I
Uh,
can't remember if it's in the Hadith reports like Al
yeah,
Bukhari, or if it's in Sirat Rasul Allah, the earliest extant biography. I can't remember.
Ibn Ishaq. Yeah, it may be an Ibn Ishaq.
Hmm.
Okay, we need to look at the Matin and the Isnad and so on before we comment if it's an authentic story. Indeed,
Hmm.
so it's a good point. But I just wanted to say that the New Testament is not what Jesus, in my view, is not what Jesus preached. That was a later compilation of books that took form, as you know, over the centuries. And in fact, it was many centuries afterwards that even the Codex Sinaiticus, the earliest New Testament we have,
Yeah, if you
not
want those
contained.
exact 27 books. But
It's
Paul,
not
don't you
contained.
agree with the common dating that the New Testament books are written roughly between 50 and 120? I mean, Jesus dies in 30, roughly speaking.
I think that the second letter of Peter is probably mid second century, the latest, and certainly not by Peter. It's a fourth
That's the dodgiest of all them, yeah, in terms
yeah.
of its authenticity. But
It's
the bulk of it is pre 100, surely, at least the three gospels
oh,
and
the
all
synoptic,
small
yeah. Oh, yeah.
letters.
But you see, the thing
Yeah.
is,
There's not enough time for a gigantic development there, is my point. There's going to
there
be
is.
tons of eyewitnesses running around.
No, no, no.
20 years later,
I think
30 years later.
there is time. Let me give you some examples, some history of how even during Ali is the son-in-law of Muhammad Ali. Uh,
Hmm.
Even during his lifetime, according to reports, there were some of his followers who thought that he was the incarnation of Allah. Ali, the incarnation
Mm,
of Allah. And this is
hmm.
still a fringe belief in Shia Islam as well.
Hmm.
Ali, understandably, was repulsed by this and banished them. Now, but the point in mentioning this is even in the lifetime of someone who absolutely was not God, never claimed to be God or whatever, people thought that he was divine in some sense, an incarnation of God himself. Another example, Haile Selassie, the Ethiopian ruler, much loved by Rastafarians. Um, he was thought to be divine as
Hmm.
well.
Hmm.
Still is thought, even in his own lifetime. Now, there are other many examples in the ancient world, where Caesars were proclaimed to be God, both at their death or maybe before their death, and so on. These things don't need time to happen; they happen at the contemporaneously with the individuals who are alive. There seems to be a tendency in some people to worship, to confuse the light they see coming from that person with the origin of that light, which is from God. And that's something that Al-Ghazali said about Christian views of Jesus, that they were so bedazzled by the light they saw in Jesus, not realizing that it came from God. And they thought that he was that God and worshipped him instead. And I'm not saying you're doing that, but so I don't
Well,
think
you
it
don't see
takes,
that. You don't see any of that in the first century,
I think
unless maybe you bring in some of these quasi-Gnostic types.
I think
Maybe.
I'm just saying that historically, in
Hmm.
religious history, it, it,
Hmm.
uh, it can happen contemporaneously with people who are alive, who are thought to be divine or even God in some sense.
Yeah,
Um,
and sometimes false predictions happen, and they
yeah,
very quickly will pivot and come up with some wonderful justification for why they'll come up with some revisionary interpretation that
yeah,
tries to save it all.
yeah. So
That's true.
you don't need time to develop. It can actually
Yeah,
happen from the start, and we see that in Islam, we see that in
yeah.
Christianity, and I dare say we see that in other. What happened to the Buddha, for
But
example?
but but
Who is
what you're
now
calling the big
God.
but Paul, what you're calling the big development is between the actual Jesus and Paul, okay? But you got Paul right in the 50s and maybe the early 60s. You have this man,
Yeah,
Jesus, born under the law.
yeah, yeah.
He's God's Christ. He gets killed. It was known in advance. It was part of God's plan. It was
Well,
sacrificial.
I don't know.
He's
I don't
been
know if
raised and vindicated and exalted. Like it's all there.
yeah,
Like,
it is. It's there in the 50s. You're right. But the thing is,
yeah,
Paul is a Hellenistic Jew. He's a Greek-speaking Jew in a
he
world
is.
where there are gods and demigods and sons
Although
of
very,
gods.
very Jewish. Remember, he's like a serious Pharisee in his background. Very, very Jewish. Not really a Philo type of fellow,
Well, I think
but he knows Greek.
he knows Greek. The
Hmm.
Greek is his first language. He's a Hellenistic Jew. He was born in Tarsus, which is part of the Greco-Roman world. He's a Roman citizen. This guy is imbued with pagan ideas of divinities and deities and sons of gods and so on, which were predominant in the pagan world. He was born into. He wasn't born in Palestine. He wasn't born in Galilee. He was born in the pagan world, and
Yeah. I mean,
he
I don't really
existed
see
for.
that in him, for there are many gods and many lords, so to speak, but for us there's one God and one Lord,
Mm,
and the
yeah.
one God is the Father. Well, that's just what you see Jesus teaching.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying everything you're saying is wrong, but I'm saying that
Hmm.
his exaltation of Jesus to a quasi-divine status, I say quasi-divine status, and his soteriology is also very similar to the pagan cults that you see in the Greco-Roman world. The idea of a savior figure who had to die or somehow be sacrificed. How uncommon was that in the ancient world?
Um, yeah, I don't know. This to me is kind of conspiracy theory stuff. You
If
can
you
find martyr type things in many contexts. You can find divine son type things in many contexts.
exactly, so
But
I think
he's inspired by this idea that Abraham really lived by faith, and there's this more fundamental thing than the law, which is just this reaction of faith and trust in God. And if you don't have that, the law is not going to do you any good.
which,
And on the face of it, he looks like he kind of thinks that the law is expired, at least for Gentiles, if not for Jews. It's a little bit unclear.
mm,
Um,
but
but
his
it's all
exaltation
very
of
it's all
Jesus.
very Jewish, right? In Acts he says, "I worship the God of my ancestors."
He says that,
Um,
but Jews themselves, when he preached, according to Acts anyway, when he went around and preached this gospel, the
mhm.
gospel of Paul in the synagogues, around the Greco-Roman world. Luke is very
Hmm.
honest about this. Usually, not always, but usually the reaction is very, very negative. And
Yeah,
I
just
think I
like it was to Jesus
no,
preaching in the synagogue.
I don't think it was like, I think it was for other reasons, because if
Luke
what Paul
chapter 4.
no, if you look at 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3, where Paul tells us what his gospel message was, that the Messiah would die according to the scriptures and rise again for the sins and rise again
Hmm.
from the dead in accordance with the scriptures. If that was it was his gospel message. So he went into your average synagogue and he preached that. Your average Jew had no this was simply not the message of Moses. This was not the teaching of Moses. Nowhere before the rise of Christianity was it ever expected that the Messiah would die for sins and be raised from the dead on the third day. So
That's right. I think the New Testament
I
has
think
additional
Paul,
information about the
no,
Messiah's role. Hmm.
but Paul says, we say additional, but Paul
Hmm.
claims, in fact, that it was there. He says it
Hmm.
was in the scriptures, the
Yep.
Jewish scriptures. So I think when Paul went to these synagogues preaching a message about the Jewish scriptures, which is plainly not in the Jewish scriptures and the teaching of Moses in the Pentateuch, I think your average Jew thought, this is not the truth. It's not in our Jewish scriptures. And so they kicked him out as an impostor or an apostate from the faith. So I think that's what happened. And I think that gut reaction from the Jews was a healthy reaction to something completely novel, something they never heard of before, even though Paul claimed it was in the scriptures themselves. But they
Yep.
knew better and they said, no, it's not on our scriptures.
Yeah, I mean, the New Testament view, and again, this is in the Synoptics, is that this was kind of a divine judgment upon them, that they should see God's Messiah come to them, and that yet be blind and reject it. And the means by which they were going to be a light to the nations and kind of throw open God's grace in a greater way to all the peoples, all the tribes of the world. So there was a judgment there. Jesus pronounces a judgment on them as rejecting God's ways.
Mm.
John critiques them harshly as, spiritually blind and constantly missing the point. Now, it's not just Paul. Remember at the end of Luke chapter 24, the risen Jesus appears and goes on a walk with some people and has a big
Yeah.
long talk with them. And it says, then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures.
Mm.
So, right at the very beginning, even before Paul, there's this conviction that, hey, we've got a new insight, into a message that people couldn't see before in the Old Testament. And so, for instance, the famous Isaiah 53, yeah, the Jews would take that commonly to be a personification of Israel.
That's
And
right.
they looked at it and said, well, maybe it meant that also, but hey, we think it also means this. And the New Testament is littered with cases where they think there was kind of a second layer of meaning there, which they think, in light of the resurrection of Jesus, they're authorized to find that there.
Can you just show me
And
where?
that's not a Paul thing. Paul got into that. Paul claimed that he was commissioned in person by the risen Jesus.
Well,
And
that's a very
apparently the other apostles accepted this, and he hung out with them and compared notes and so on. This is all pre-Paul, really.
I think
The
well,
basics.
I think the earliest New Testament claim we have is Paul's own letter in 1 Corinthians 15, where he says the idea of the Messiah dying for sins
Mm-hmm.
and being buried and rising on the third day is all there in the Jewish Bible. That's what he says in 1 Corinthians 15:3.
Yes.
I'm
He
not a
thinks
Jew.
they didn't know it, though.
I'm not a Jew, but I have actually read the Old Testament, the whole Bible, and I can't find any verses anywhere that actually say that. Can you show me where it says that anywhere in the Old Testament?
Well, everybody thinks Isaiah 53 is a prediction of that, which couldn't be seen beforehand,
Does
but
it
can be
mention,
seen
does it
now.
mention the Messiah?
So he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that's led to slaughter.
Does it
This is
mention?
precisely what you see in the accounts of his trial and crucifixion.
But
Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain,
Mhm.
etc.
But okay, I mean, firstly, in original context, I think you might agree this refers to Israel, and this is what most Old Testament
Mhm,
scholars today
mhm.
stand. It's not Jewish blindness; it is simply the text read in context if you read chapters 49 onwards, the servant is the personification of Israel itself. But also,
Yeah.
in that very passage, it doesn't mention a Messiah. It doesn't mention the Messiah, but according to Paul, somewhere in the Jewish scriptures it does. It also doesn't say that he was buried and raised on the third day in that passage. So where does it say in the Old Testament that the Messiah would die and be raised on the third day, which is Paul's claim?
Gee, the exact third day. I off the top of my head, I can't think of a third day prediction. Maybe there's one that I'm not thinking of right now. But look, you're flat disagreeing with Jesus's critique of the Jews, his own people and his own generation,
No, no,
right?
that's a different matter. That's a different subject. The Jews
Uh,
are to be a light to the Gentiles. You're
this-
absolutely right. But we're talking
yeah,
about Paul's claims about Jesus' death and resurrection for sins being specifically detailed in the scriptures. And you've already said the Jews were blinded and didn't see it, and that's why God
right.
judged
But
them.
that's Jesus in the Synoptics, Matthew 15. Let them alone; they are blind guides of the blind. If one
That's not
blind
talking,
person guides another, both will fall into a pit.
that's not talking about this passage where Christ died for the sins and rose to the dead on the third day. That's
Right.
their general spiritual stubbornness and unwillingness to be responsive to the ministry of Jesus. I get that.
Mm-hmm.
But my point is that what Paul is claiming in 1 Corinthians 15 is essentially a made up story that Jews at the time couldn't see verified from their prophet Moses. And you yourself can't actually reference a single passage anywhere where it says the Messiah would die and be raised from the dead on the third day, even though that is the very claim
Yeah,
of
they do
Paul
think there
himself.
are resurrection claims in there, and in Matthew, you repeatedly have Jesus predicting about the third day.
Yeah. So
So yeah, I'm not sure about this third day thing specifically, but this is
that's what
hardly a defeater for the overall claim, right? Their biggest piece of evidence is that they have seen and talked to Jesus, and Paul is among them.
mm.
And if they didn't have that, they wouldn't be buying this whole
I'm
perspective.
not doubting that Paul had a vision. He himself calls it a
Hmm.
vision in
Yes.
Acts 29. Lots of
Yep.
people have visions. Catholics have visions of Mary all the time. Muslims, some of them
Hmm.
have visions of Muhammad. That this is not news. But what is
Hmm.
a specifically empirical claim about objective scriptures teaching X, and when you actually check those scriptures for X, I, for the life of me, cannot see where it says in the Jewish scriptures that the Messiah would die and rise on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. I think this is Paul. Comes from Paul. It's not from Jesus. I know you referenced the Gospels, but remember the Gospels are written much later, and may
A
well show
bit later.
influence.
Yeah.
Uh,
Much later. Yeah. 20 years, 30
yeah,
years, a bit
yeah.
later.
So the idea, and the Gospels were based on oral tradition, according to biblical scholars. These are stories that were told and retold from community to community, and of course, the belief that Jesus died for sins could easily have been mentioned
Hmm.
as part of that narrative, as it was passed verbally down from person to person to person to person to person over the years, over many years.
Hmm.
So I'm not surprised that the story developed as it did, but we have a textual bit of evidence here for Paul's belief, the earliest belief that we have in the New Testament. And I think when Jews heard that in the synagogues around the Greco-Roman world, they pushed him out because it's false to the prophet Moses. Moses never taught this. Moses is their prophet primarily. He never taught this. He never said that Messiah would have to die and rise again on the third day. And therefore, if it's an unheard of, they're told in Deuteronomy, if a false prophet comes along saying things that you have not been taught of, it says in Deuteronomy, this is Moses speaking, they are to reject it. And so they're obeying the Torah in rejecting
Yeah.
Paul as
Yeah,
something.
but look, you're fastening on one detail of the entire story and saying, "Show me this one detail as predicted." I'm not sure that matters, honestly.
Really,
Look, there's
it's the
plenty of
gospel.
things to work off there, right? The prediction of a prophet like me in Deuteronomy 18. Again, Jesus doesn't teach, according to the Gospels or Paul, worship of another god. Nor is Jesus taught to be another god. Nor is Jesus taught to be a lesser God.
Mm,
Jesus is taught to be the human Messiah who's now been raised and made immortal,
yeah.
but given this super duper high position under God,
Mm,
so that he actually has to be religiously honored under God to the glory of God.
mm,
So it's not like a case of a false prophet as envisioned by the Old Testament. He is understood as a prophet in the New Testament, but is somebody much greater than any mere prophet, So the prophet language kind of falls away in favor of the Christ and Lord language. Lord essentially gets a new meaning in the New Testament, whereas it could before be a substitute for the divine name. It could just be a polite term of address like sir, or it could basically mean like boss or master.
Yeah.
It gets a second highest meaning. It's basically a new coining a new term, really. It's the one Lord under the one God.
I, I think in
And
this
so then
Gnostic
they see references to the Lord in the Greek Old Testament, the Greek version of the Old Testament, as having to do with Jesus, right?
I think we're dealing here with the transposition from a Jewish context, say in Palestine, where people may have addressed Jesus as Lord in the sense of teacher, as you rightly say. But once this language then moves into the Greco-Roman world with the Gentilization of the church through Paul and others, then these terms take on a different meaning. There's a cultural transposition here from a Jewish context to a pagan context. And these new meanings, like the word Christ, for example, even in Paul, becomes his surname. Well, not quite the surname, but a second name. So Jesus Christ is his name. But of course,
Jesus the
Christ,
Christ. Yeah, it's like a title. Yeah.
exactly. But of
It's
course,
name like, but look, it's very early.
and then it becomes a name. So you
Yeah.
already see this development. But with law, with kurios, is much more. You move along the spectrum from the lower end of the spectrum of meaning, as you say, sir or teacher, up to the higher end of the spectrum. But as
Yeah.
you move into the Gentile world, where lords were plenty, Caesar could be lord, it is a much more promiscuous and flexible use of this language.
Let me make one point and then come back to the later developments, because I think there's something very, very important to see about those. But about the business of being Lord, right? It's right in the earliest recorded Christian sermon. Peter says, God has made him both Lord and Messiah, this Jesus whom you crucified.
Yeah.
Right. So it's the man Jesus. It's not this invisible, divine figure or whatever.
That's
No,
right.
this man has been made Lord. And but anyway, the biggest twist, I think, and I'm not exactly sure why this happens, and I think it probably has something to do with the Gnostics in the 2nd century, but I can't back that up. It's just a hunch.
Yeah.
The most mysterious thing to me about all the development of Christology is this one fact, that by the time you get to the end of the 2nd century, quote, mere man philanthropist views are just considered obviously wrong. Why? That's very bizarre, right?
Yeah.
And I remember talking to a well-known patristic scholar and philosopher about this one time privately, and his answer was, look, they think the way you detect natures is by characteristic actions. Okay.
Right.
So when you see crying and limited knowledge and hunger, you're in the presence of a human nature. When you see miracles or divine teaching, you're in the presence of a divine nature.
Yeah.
And so there clearly is a divine nature there.
That's right.
Now, the dynamic monarchians, I think, had the correct response to that, which is, of course, there's a divine nature there in the sense of a divine being. It's God. Like God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. The Father in me does his works, he says in John. So, yeah, you see him doing miracles and bringing divine teaching. There's something divine there, but it's God. It's the Father working through him.
Exactly.
Now, but they seem to think that you had to attribute it to the agent himself.
Yeah. Right.
And I think the Gnostics, and this is the part I kind of hate the Gnostics. I think they're a bunch of occultic knuckleheads, and they're so undisciplined, and they're so crazy, and they're so boldly departing from the New Testament is just plain Jane, straightforward compared to anything Gnostic.
This is very true.
They're infuriating, and I have friends that have spent a lot more time, trying to untangle what on earth is going on with these 2nd century Gnostics. First of all, it's clear they're infesting the mainstream. They're in the mainstream churches.
Yeah.
And they weren't really recognized as a body. As the 2nd century goes on, they get called out more and more. Marcion, I think, is something different, but he gets thrown out. He's like the Gnostics in certain respects, but other people like Valentin, there's not really a standard. It's just a bunch of these teachers all kind of trying to hijack the movement in their own way, basically. I think they started insisting that there must be a continuity of nature, that Jesus must be homoousion with the Father.
Mm, mm.
And so I think somebody like Irenaeus, he does think there is a sameness there, because this second lesser God derives from the first. The way Tertullian puts it is that he's actually a materialist about God. He thinks spirit is just a finer kind of matter, like the
That's right.
Stoics.
Yeah.
And he thinks God, all of the divine matter composes God.
Mm,
So only he is fully divine, but he sort of extends a piece of that matter out.
yeah.
And then that portion of the matter, a lesser portion than the whole, also composes the Son while still composing the Father.
Right.
But it's actually a different being. You have one portion of matter which fully constitutes this lesser being, and yet it's still part of the matter that constitutes this greater being.
Yeah.
But it's still not a multi-personal God, because the one true God is the Father, still in this weird scheme.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think the Gnostics, I think they had to compete with the Gnostics,
Yes.
and felt the need not to just have this Jew who is empowered by God's Spirit, which is what you see in the New Testament. Even in John, it's what you see. You never see him. There's no hint anywhere in the New Testament that he's sort of displaying his divine powers when he does these amazing things, whether it's the teaching or the miracles. It's always understood to be God has anointed him with power to do these things.
Mm.
Okay, but so yeah, once you take that fatal step, there's then mere man views are just laughably wrong.
Mm, mm.
But still, you had lots of lay people thinking this.
Yes.
Well into the 200s, you even have a bishop of a major city, Photinus, taking this kind of view in the middle of the 300s. So it's a view that has deep roots, because the New Testament is just very straightforward in calling Jesus a man. And all the pre-existence stuff, and did God create through him? I think there's good New Testament reasons for this language.
Mm.
But as you get away from that, and it has partly to do with the transition from Jews to Gentiles, then sort of the original justifications are forgotten. And they're very in love
Yeah.
with this logos, with this second lesser God,
Yeah.
because
Yeah. Yeah.
this logos is accessible in a way that God isn't. And again,
Yes.
lets them bring on board all the wonderful Greek heritage and so on.
I think that that's a very helpful sketch, actually, and particularly about the Gnostics. Fascinating. I remember first encountering Logos theology at university and being God, I knew nothing about it. It was simply
Mm-hmm.
unknown to me, and being completely surprised that this was the dominant paradigm in the second century, not Trinitarianism and so on. I thought, wow, So it
It was
really
the
did.
dominant paradigm with those few elites that we still have. That's very
True.
important. It's very
No,
important to see that.
no, you are right. Okay, you're
Mhm.
absolutely right.
The ones that were later
Yes, yes. No,
passed on to us,
yeah,
amongst them, it's dominant, yes.
yeah.
But
No,
at the time,
that's
I think it was
really
very much an edgy view.
yeah. You are right. There's an important caveat that that's very true. I think my only response to what you say, I mean, I agree with what you say, is it is a negative one, a critical one, in that the plasticity, it seems to me, of these texts are patient of multiple interpretations. We see that in the church, and we can't just say that Augustine was. We're not saying that, but we can't just say these people didn't get what was obvious to the page to you. They saw it differently. They read it through their own tradition, these texts,
Yeah.
their own inherited tradition. And that's part, I think, for me, is part of the tragedy of Christianity. That unlike, say, with Islam, let's say the Quran, I mean, where Tawheed is unambiguous. The Ahad, the sense of the oneness and unity of God, is unambiguous in the Quran. There is ambiguity for all the excellent reasons you said, and I've looked at great. I agree with your exegesis by and large, but nevertheless there is this ambiguity, and it is patient of other interpretations. When you move into these other contexts, Gnostic contexts or later church contexts, and I think that is to change the metaphor, the Achilles heel of the whole religion, that it can produce these diverse interpretations in good faith by people who are really clever, who really look at the text, but come to radically different conclusions. I don't think anyone can come to, looking at the Quran, can come to polytheistic or multi-personal or interpretations. Or maybe you can if you, Abyssinia, perhaps.
Well, yeah, but
Maybe he did, but
the downfall
yeah,
of any written text is it doesn't talk back at you when you
that,
misinterpret it.
there's a
The
good point.
glory of a written text is
Yeah,
it's very hard to change it.
yeah,
And changing purposely changing it to suit you is very difficult and usually doesn't work. The downfall is it doesn't talk back to you when you sit there and gleefully misinterpret it.
yes,
Um,
very
Now
good point.
look, but let's be honest about Islam. Yeah, the Quran itself is thoroughly monotheistic, but Islamic tradition has had to fight off
Yes,
polytheistic type things down to the present day.
absolutely
It
right. No,
comes
yeah,
up over and over. It's like a human thing.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I myself have been to a shrine. I believe it was Haji Ali in Mumbai, India,
Right.
which was frequented both by Muslims. I take it Sunnis. I'm not sure about that, but maybe both. It was frequented by Muslims and by Hindus. Hindus they'll sort of join in with anything. They like to
Of
cover
course.
their bases. They'll go to the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
They'll
Jesus God, no problem. Bring it on, bring it on. Yeah,
they'll
absolutely.
worship Mary. They'll go to
Yeah,
the Sikh thing, the Sikh
exactly.
Gurdwara. But anyway, I mean, look, yeah, the Shia, they're accused of worshiping Muhammad and how they do their prayers. You
Ali.
have the shrine at his tomb.
Yeah,
You have the various saints that they believe are kind of
yeah,
intercessors. You have all the little offshoots where there's other characters you can worship. The smaller, more marginal things. So I mean,
yeah. No,
the
you're
polytheism comes back. I think
right. I agree.
the reason is that there's a perennial temptation to believe that God has ordained this sort of technology for us to use by which we can control things.
Mm.
And the technology is lesser deities that we have access to via idols, basically, or holy places, or lucky charms, and all kinds of things. And it's basically a magical kind of belief.
Mm.
If we will just honor this guy and appease that gal and do this, we can maybe cure our infertility
Yeah,
or protect ourselves from war.
yeah,
And it just keeps coming back over and over. It's in Judaism too. So
yes,
no matter how monotheistic you
yes.
get, you're always fighting this off. I'm grateful that Protestantism rolled back the clock in this respect because I think all the worship of saints is completely wrongheaded.
Mm,
I honor somebody like Mary. I think she was a great woman of faith as she's taught in the New Testament,
mm.
but I don't think that I should pray to her or have her be my intercessor,
No,
much
no.
less a co-mediatrix, as some of the Catholics get into. To
Although
me,
Pope Francis, of course, as we know, just literally 2 days ago, rejected that as a valid
yeah,
expression of Catholic
Paul
faith.
would have a freaking fit. He'd tear his clothes and throw dirt on his face, if he
He would.
saw
He would.
if he saw what has become standard practice in Catholicism and in Eastern Orthodoxy.
And I think Jesus would have a
Um,
fit if he saw what Paul did to his faith. But that's
even the
Mm,
Sikhs are very interesting
mm.
people, very admirable in many ways,
The
beautiful,
monotheists. Yeah,
fascinating people. They're sort of combining Islam with monotheistic Hinduism,
yeah.
and they were always against idolatry, and yet they literally idolize their book.
Mm.
And they do have images as well. They don't really idolize those, but like they literally bow down to their book and they
Really,
walk
I didn't know.
circles around it. Yeah,
Wow,
when you come into a gurdwara, you're supposed to bow down, forehead on the ground in front of their book, which is on a pedestal. They
wow.
put it on a pedestal like it's kind of like a king, basically. And there's half of the time there's a guy sitting behind it with a horsetail fan, kind of like fanning it, like to keep it comfortable.
Well,
And they think it's
I wonder if
inhabited. They think it's inhabited by the guru. Like
even Muslims don't treat the Quran like that, and they see that as the literal speech of God.
yeah.
The Muslims don't do that. Thank goodness.
But what mainstream Muslims have, they too have a little bit of very muted image honoring in the sense of the whole tradition about the big black cube and everything. So they're not. If idolatry is basically honoring something that's not God, as if it or not not a great self, as if it were one, And they kind of do that. They think
Oh,
that
no,
God has authorized the honoring of they think Adam built it and so on.
no, the
They
Kaaba is
too
not.
have their
The
very,
Kaaba
very
is,
constricted
yeah, I don't think that's true. I
image
think the
honoring.
Kaaba is not seen in that. The Kaaba is seen as a center of focus of unity where people pray towards throughout the globe. When people pray
Mhm.
towards that direction, they're not praying to the Kaaba. They're praying to God. There's not a, I
Well,
think,
yeah,
understanding there. This
they
understanding
think it's
about.
an access point, though, just like the idolater thinks that God is especially present in the Vishnu statue or whatever, or in the temple.
I think anyone.
They
I think
think it's They think it's a special access point, right? That's why you go on Hajj, so you can have this. You can become especially close to God through this uniquely ordained means.
it's just
I know
it's
they're not praying to it literally.
they're not praying to
Hmm.
the Kaaba at all. That's a misunderstanding. It's to do with a superficial observation of the physical prostration towards the
Hmm.
direction where the Kaaba is. But it is a center of unity. But the rotation, the circum around the Kaaba is meant to be what Abraham did. It's
Yeah.
the
No,
Kaaba itself.
it's an old form of religious worship. It's
Yeah,
what Buddhists do to the mounds that contain some of the ashes of the Buddha.
I
They've
don't
always
think it's idolatry
circumambulated
because
those.
I don't think that they don't think God lives in that house like some Jews thought God Yahweh lived in the temple. That's not. It's not
It's not
analogy.
quite like that. That's right. That's right. But it is a PowerPoint,
Yeah, it's significant.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I don't think
Yeah.
it's idolatry in that people are bowing down to the consciously intention. The intention in the mind and in the teaching is absolutely not to worship the Kaaba. It is to worship the God who is unseen. That's just
Yeah.
that's all over the place in the Islamic sources. That's always been the case.
The biblical perspective is you can have forbidden idolatry even if your object you think is representing God.
Mm,
And it seems to be what's happening with the golden calf
mm,
in that famous incident, because when they create the calf and worship it, they declare a feast day for Yahweh.
mm.
And yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
so I know Islamic tradition doesn't count it as idolatry. I'm saying maybe I would, if you just kind of look at it in a very generic conception of what idolatry is. When I use idolatry, I'm using it just as a descriptive term.
Well, that's a very serious sin in Islam, as it is in Christian
Mhm.
Judeo-Christianity. But I think if you come to it from the position that you're coming from, I can see what you're saying. But I think if you come from it from position, an informed position of the Islamic understanding of it and what is actually going on, then it's not seen as idolatrous because the cube itself is not the focus. It is,
Yeah,
uh, but I mean, this is by the by, and you can have that
but
conversation.
that's how a lot of pagans defend their idolatry, is like, well, I'm not really praying to this piece of wood. Obviously, I know this wood is not Vishnu. Vishnu's everywhere and eternal and unseen. But it's just that Vishnu is so gracious that he allows us to experience him through this object.
Yeah. You see,
Yeah.
that's not how Muslims understand the Kaaba as experiencing God's grace through the Kaaba. I don't see the analogy there.
Um, I mean, look, one way to put my objection is they define idolatry so as not to include this.
Well, there we are then. It's
Just
not a problem.
by their definition, it's not idolatry, right?
No,
So,
but you gave a definition which includes okay, like the pagans who say, oh no, it's not the object itself, the statue.
yeah,
It's God coming through me through the statue in a kind of
yeah,
spiritual way. That's not analogous to the Kaaba at all. That's not how Muslims perceive the Kaaba as a sacrament in a way, or a kind of sacrament of grace in the Catholic sense of the Eucharist. They don't see it like that. They just don't. It's simply a box. But I see where you're
it's
coming
not
from.
simply a box.
No, it's no, but
I can't just go walk up and take some photographs of it.
you wouldn't be allowed in Mecca in the first place.
That's right.
I see where you're coming from, but I
Yeah.
think the danger is having that kind of history of religions, anthropology, and seeing it here, rather than looking at the uniqueness of the Islamic understanding of the Kaaba as your starting point. I think you come into different, not the same conclusion. I don't think. Anyway, it doesn't bother me what if you think that terribly, but I understand where you're coming from on that. Um, I think we have been talking, I think, for several hours, and it has
Yeah, we
flown.
should probably find some way to wrap it up. What have we not talked about that you
Well,
wanted to talk about?
we've talked about. No, I'm just. Uh, it's flown past as these things often do when you're talking to fascinating people. But no, you covered everything. I was going to go into some text by Irenaeus, but I really, it's not important to me. there's been more than enough that we've discussed, to be honest, and it's absolutely fascinating. And I'm happy to conclude it here, so we can go away, and I can have my cup of tea, and you can have, well, cup of coffee. Is it, you Tennessee
Yeah,
people?
we've been doing coffee here. Yep.
So we both probably need the lavatory.
Keeping a stiff upper lip, but I haven't taken to the tea quite yet. Although I used to drink tea when I lived in the cold, frozen north.
Well, can I
Tea's
ask
good.
a question? Because Americans, I understand, love to talk about their past. Are you, where are you, what are you descended from in terms of the people? Are you descended from English people or Irish, or
You
do you,
just hit the nail on the head. You probably looked at my fat white face and you figured that out instinctively. Yeah,
you're
my sister took one of those genealogy tests, and we are like 100%
British?
those two things. So all, Northern European, because they have all the Viking type people mixed in with them.
Because you could be from a town up north in England. You could be from Leicester or Birmingham, or
Yeah,
if it wasn't for your Texan accent, I wouldn't
yeah.
know. Yeah.
Yeah, no, when I was there, I remember walking around like, oh, these people look like they're related to me.
And they probably
Tuggies,
are.
yeah, Tuggies come from, they came from England in the mid 1800s from the Reading area.
Not far from London.
Yeah.
Wow, from
Yeah,
Reading.
there was a guy, Henry Tuggy. He made it all the way to Denver, Colorado. You can still see his picture in the YMCA in Colorado.
That's amazing. Well, why did he
Um,
emigrate from here, just down the road, to the States?
I really don't know. I really don't know. It
For
must have
better life,
been
perhaps, for better life.
seeking his fortune
Yeah,
somehow.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I don't know what he really did, but you can see this fat faced, bearded guy who looks like he could be related to me. I've seen the photo.
So
My sister's into genealogy.
so genetics is still there, even from the 18th century. You can see the connection. That's amazing.
Yeah, they married similar people. My grandmother on the one side married an Irish Catholic guy.
Right.
He died young. I could have very well been raised Catholic if that poor guy hadn't died like when he was 40.
Gosh.
Um, so yeah, it's all English and Irish. So
Have you been to Reading yourself?
no, I haven't. I've been to the UK a couple of times. I saw London, Edinburgh, some Glasgow, Stirling,
Sterling time.
a little bit of Aberdeen.
Gosh.
But I'd love to go again. There's just so many things to see there, and I'm aware of all the history. I'm a big history
Yeah,
buff.
I mean, Oscar Wilde famously wrote his ballad of Reading Jail in Reading. That jail is still there on a hill somewhere in Reading. You can still see it today.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, it's
so-
possible some hard drinking tuggies were thrown in there at some point. Uh,
but it's clearly extremely successful migration from here to where you are, because you're still obviously thriving as a family, the Tuggies, and may you continue to thrive in the future. That's amazing. I guess we'll leave it there so we can both go and have our teas and coffees. It's been absolutely fabulous. Thank you for enduring my cross examination. I thought I'd just take you out for a spin, so to speak, your brain, and see where I go. And
oh, I appreciate the conversation, Paul. It's been a lot of fun.
it has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much. And I understand you're going to have a similar, not a similar, another meeting with a guy from New Jersey, a Muslim guy from New Jersey. Is it tomorrow on his channel?
Yeah,
He's a nice guy.
I assume he's an American adult convert to Islam, but I'm not really sure. I haven't talked to him yet.
Sure either, actually. Could be. Yeah, yeah. But I think he is a doctor in his job, but I think he's now been seduced by the dark side of theology. So he's definitely interested in that now.
The dark side of theology, as
No, I didn't
opposed
mean
to
dark side of theology. I mean theology, from the
the
hard
helpful
side.
sciences of medicine.
Yes, from the healthy preoccupation of doing medicine
Yeah,
to the black hole of theology. No, I'm only being
yeah.
fun. Um,
Well, before we go, I'll say one thing that's relevant to the conversation that we just had.
hmm,
The UCA that I'm the chair of, the Unitarian Christian Alliance, is working hard on publishing two books, its first two publications. One of them is a really interesting piece by a guy named Thomas Emlin, who in the 1690s read a bunch of controversial literature about the Trinity and became a Unitarian. And he
wow,
ended up getting thrown in jail in
wow.
Dublin, Ireland for this, where he served hard time for about 2 years. And then he eventually was let out. He was one of the last people in Britain to be imprisoned under blasphemy laws.
Gosh.
And the man never blasphemed a day in his life. He's the most respectable guy you could imagine. He just came to held a type of Unitarian
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
theology and Christology. So we're publishing a very interesting book by him.
Oh, fascinating.
Another very interesting book we're publishing is by a PhD who studied church history. And basically, it's about the dynamic monarchians and trying to figure out what the heck was going on with them. The sources are very poor
Mm.
because all we have are the statements of their enemies, basically,
Yeah,
and just little tiny snippets of what they said.
yeah.
But he's trying to, in the way that a historian does, he's trying to historically reconstruct kind of what that movement was about, what was the extent of it, what were their beliefs, how did they approach the Bible, and it's really very groundbreaking stuff. So we're in the middle of editing that book.
Oh, it's
I hope to
amazing.
have it out later this year.
So you're reclaiming the early church really for yourself here. You're dusting off and trying to recreate these
Yeah,
movements that have been gobbled up by the opposition, so to speak, and saying,
yeah,
no, this was a distinct school. Here is the evidence. Here's the scholarship. Here we are.
yeah.
And, oh
They
wow.
claim their view is the oldest view that was in the Gospels.
Yeah.
Tertullian and Origen tell us, that many of the simple believers hold this type of view, and so these are the guys who are getting defeated in the 200s and 300s very slowly, bit
Mm,
by bit, as the Logos theory kind of gets more and more entrenched,
wow.
and or kind of the Origenist heritage gets more entrenched as time goes on. But they're still kicking, they're still around. When the emperor settled the whole Nicene dispute in 380
Wow.
and
Oh yeah.
381.
Yeah, indeed. Oh, that's
It's a very fascinating piece of kind of lost history there.
yeah.
It's a good book. It's very, very groundbreaking.
Who would this be published by? Do we know?
It'll be published by the Unitarian Christian Alliance,
Okay.
where we have an imprint called Theophilus Press.
Theophilus,
Hmm.
lover of God. Is that deliberately taking Luke's the
Yeah,
name Luke mentions, or is it okay?
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. But
yeah.
it's a
So
good,
I'm involved in some of the editing for that, but not the writing.
right.
Just
Okay.
kind of trying to help fully fashion it,
Yeah. Oh,
and some other UCA members are as well.
that's certainly noble work that needs to be done to to bring back that diversity in the early church. It wasn't all just the proto-orthodox, as Bart Ehrman calls them. It wasn't
Hmm.
just them beating the drums. There was
Yeah.
actual other people as well. That's
Yeah, and it
good.
wasn't total chaos either. I mean, these people were their mind; they were the conservatives.
Yes, this is the irony. These were
Hmm.
yes, they weren't the innovators, they were the conservatives, ironically. Yeah.
Hmm.
No, this is very true. Well,
Yep.
that's amazing. Well, thank you very much, sir. I really appreciate your time and your erudition and the fun sparring it's been as well about all sorts of things. So, and good luck tomorrow with my colleague. I can't remember his name. Anyway, in New Jersey, he's a lovely guy, and he might give you a hard time as well.
Okay,
I'm sure you can cope. I'm sure you can more
it's
than
all
cope
fair.
with us. It's just to keep it interesting and spicy a bit, I guess.
Yeah,
But, um, but thank you
it's in
so
the
much.
service of truth. It's all good.
It is, and I certainly do respect you enormously for your work, and will continue to pay attention to it because it is so helpful in the precisely in that in the investigation of truth. So thank you for that.
All right, Paul. Thanks again.
All right, take care, mate. Thank you.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.